Hey guys, tonight we're inside a palace where the king talks to angels and sometimes forgets he's king. Serving George III means silence, secrets, and surviving the storm behind the throne. So, while you're getting comfortable, feel free to tap like and subscribe if this kind of calm, late night history is your thing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it was when you pressed play. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can hear him before you see him. A low thudding behind the heavy doors, rhythmic like footsteps or fists, then silence, then a sudden shout that rises like steam bursting through pipework. The corridor trembles in its silence afterward, and you remain still, tray in hand, silver lids trembling over a lukewarm breakfast that nobody wants to serve and nobody dares refuse. This is your third week stationed outside the royal apartments, and already you know better than to react. Reacting gets you reassigned, if you're lucky. If not, it gets you noticed. And no one in Windsor Castle wants to be noticed right now, especially not by the man pacing inside. The king is ill again. That's the word they use, ill, as if it's a cold, as if you could tie a scarf around it, or dab it away with vinegar and cloth. But this isn't the kind of illness anyone understands. Some days he's cheerful and brilliant, quoting Latin and asking you politely about your family. No, you've never answered. Other days, like today, he throws shoes at the wall and talks to his dead brother as if he's standing right behind you. The other servants say it comes in waves. There are days of quiet. Then suddenly, you're holding down a man in silk nightclothes while the doctor calls for restraints with trembling hands. The walls are thick here, velvet draped and paneled with fine wood, but sound finds a way through anyway. The guards posted just out of sight exchange glances they think you can't see. One shifts his weight. Another wipes his forehead with the cuff of his glove. They're not worried about danger, not exactly. It's the embarrassment, the helplessness of being part of something you're not supposed to talk about. The man screaming inside is your king, after all, and you're still expected to bow when he emerges and pretend it never happened. Pretend you didn't hear the ranting about invisible ministers or the whispers to angels that came through the bedposts. You weren't supposed to be here. When you first arrived at Windsor, you thought you'd be trimming hedges or polishing boots in the far corners of the grounds, not standing guard with a breakfast tray while royalty unraveled in real time. The majordomo never explained why you were selected, only that you were to report directly to Dr. Willis's staff. That alone should have been your warning. Everyone knows Willis, the physician who treats His Majesty. The man smells faintly of ink and vinegar, and his hands always tremble just a little, like someone trying to thread a needle in a thunderstorm. He doesn't say much, just barks orders and wipes his spectacles more often than he wears them. It's an open secret among the staff now. The king is not well. He speaks without stopping, sometimes for hours, until his throat goes hoarse and his lips start to bleed. He waves off meals, demands they be brought again 5 minutes later, then forgets he's ordered them at all. You've been summoned twice already to clean spilled ink, and once to remove a chamber pot, flung in a fit of either rage or divine inspiration. No one was sure which. When he's lucid, he apologizes profusely, even insists on offering you a coin or two. But when the fog sets in, he doesn't recognize your face, doesn't remember your name, and sometimes calls you general with a laugh that trails off into weeping. No one tells you exactly what's wrong. You're left to guess, to piece it together from overheard fragments between courtiers, or the occasional loud whisper behind a drawn curtain. Some say it's a punishment for how he handled the war in America, that his mind snapped under the pressure of defeat and disgrace. Others insist it's in the blood, something passed down from the Hanoverian line, dormant and dangerous. The truth, if anyone knows it, is locked behind doors heavier than the ones you stand beside now. Despite the chaos, the routine of the palace marches on like clockwork. Breakfast is served, floors are polished, silver is laid out with perfect symmetry, and invitations are still delivered by footmen in pristine livery. There's a strange dignity in it all, a refusal to acknowledge that anything is wrong, as though etiquette can outlast madness, or that decorum might eventually convince the brain to behave. You do your part, too. You fold napkins, you nod, you keep your mouth shut. Even when you wake up from shallow sleep to the sound of furniture being thrown 3 rooms over, you keep quiet and wait for instructions. But not everyone is so good at pretending. Some of the younger staff have been reassigned. A few have quit altogether. One girl in the kitchens, Anne, you think her name was, refused to serve soup after he insisted it contained a message from God, written in vermicelli. She's gone now. Where? No one says. Probably back to her village. Probably smart. Today feels worse than most. There's a change in the atmosphere, something tighter in the air, like thunder in your lungs. The doctors are pacing outside the study, voices low but tense. One of them slams a book shut without warning, and the echo makes the guards flinch. A lady in waiting is crying quietly into her sleeve as she leaves the Queen's rooms. Whatever storm is coming, you know you'll be the one standing in the doorway, holding a towel or a candle or a basin while it passes. You take a deep breath, steady the tray in your hands, and nod when they gesture for you to enter. The door creaks open. The king is kneeling in the center of the room, surrounded by papers, muttering to himself and tracing lines on the carpet with his finger. He doesn't look up as you approach. He just keeps speaking, almost gently, as if reciting instructions from another world. You leave the tray on the table and back away slowly, eyes on the floor. The door shuts behind you, and for a moment, everything is still. But then comes the knock from one of the guards, low and urgent. The Queen is requesting tea, and she wants it served personally by you. You hesitate just for a second before straightening your coat and setting off down the corridor toward her private sitting room. You've never been summoned directly by the Queen before. And as you approach, the air grows quieter, heavier, like the hush before a snowfall, or the calm before something breaks. You knock, the door opens, and you step inside, only to find that you're not alone with her. The king has arrived as well, unannounced, barefoot and beaming, ready to deliver a sermon about heaven's windows opening over Windsor. He doesn't knock. He doesn't have to. The door to Queen Charlotte's sitting room swings open on a gust of cold morning air, and in strides the King of Great Britain, barefoot, eyes shining, with his dressing gown trailing behind him like a banner in the wind. For a moment, no one moves. Not the ladies in waiting, who had been quietly stitching in the corner. Not the Queen, who sits frozen mid-sip, her teacup paused halfway to her lips. And certainly not you, still standing awkwardly by the fireplace with the silver tray, the steam from the teapot already fading into the heavy air. He greets the room as if it's a congregation, not with words of command, but with proclamation, as though he's just stepped down from a mountaintop, clutching a revelation only he can understand. He raises both hands and declares, "The Lord has shown me the gears behind the clouds." And then he laughs, bright, unguarded, childlike. It echoes strangely against the tall ceilings, bouncing between the portraits of long-dead ancestors who seem, in that moment, more lucid than their descendant. The Queen sets her teacup down without a sound. Her eyes do not meet yours. Her fingers grip the edge of the chair just a little too tightly. You can tell this isn't the first time. It might not even be the worst time, but it is a bad time. He turns to her with such tenderness that it aches. "Charlotte, do you see them?" He whispers. "The angels have written your name in the frost this morning. I saw it from the south window. God's own handwriting." She does not answer. She only nods once, almost imperceptibly, and murmurs something you can't hear. One of the ladies in waiting discreetly rises and exits the room, likely to alert Dr. Willis. The rest of you are left in the strange, fragile silence of a shared performance. The king walks to the window and begins speaking to the trees. Not at them, not about them, but to them, as if they are old friends who've waited patiently through the night. He tells them about the stars. He explains the celestial harmonies he heard last evening. He gestures to the sunrise, which he insists is a blush of divine approval. You try not to breathe too loudly. You don't dare interrupt. The queen motions softly toward the tea, and you place it before her, hands careful not to clink a single spoon. She still does not look up. The king turns suddenly and faces you. Have you heard the trumpets? He asks. You, young man, have you heard them calling? Your stomach drops. You know better than to answer, but his gaze is fixed and waiting. You stammer out a quiet, "No, your majesty." He nods solemnly. Then they will come for you soon, he says. Be ready. The trumpet is for those who do not listen. They'll carry you by your buttons if you do not kneel. You freeze in place, unsure whether this is a threat, a prophecy, or some cryptic metaphor from a mind that's wandered too far. The queen finally stands, slowly, with the stiff dignity of someone lifting more than just her own weight. Come, George, she says, in a voice so gentle it nearly breaks. Let's sit together. We can pray. But the king doesn't sit. He's pacing now, reciting lines from Virgil in a sing-song voice. Then he drifts into Hebrew, then Latin again. It's all seamless to him, a choir of languages spoken in a melody only he understands. The ladies in waiting begin to fidget. One bites her lip. Another crosses herself discreetly. You've heard stories from the others, how he once wrote nonstop for hours without punctuation, pages and pages of manic scrawl, how he went days without sleep, speaking until his throat gave out, how he once insisted he was dead and needed to be embalmed immediately. But this moment in the sitting room, is quieter, more surreal than anything they described. He's not angry. He's radiant. He believes he's been chosen. Dr. Willis arrives with his assistants in a flurry of quiet boots and leather bags. The king embraces him, calling him Elijah, and thanking him for bringing messages from the mount. Willis smiles thinly and offers a gloved hand, while one assistant prepares the tincture meant to calm him. The queen steps back. No one needs to tell her what happens next. You are ushered out with the other servants, tea unfinished, tray still trembling slightly in your hands. The door closes behind you, and that's that. Another morning dissolved into something both intimate and bizarre. You're told to return to your normal duties, though what those are now feels increasingly difficult to define. What is normal in a palace where the king preaches to tree branches and bows to invisible choirs? Later that afternoon, as you sweep the stairwell near the king's apartments, you hear singing from inside again. Not hymns this time, something he's making up on the spot. The lyrics don't rhyme. The tune doesn't resolve. It goes in circles, rising and falling, like a bird that can't remember how to land. You listen for a few moments, broom in hand, then quietly return to your work. These moments come and go now, like unpredictable weather. All you can do is carry on. But the unpredictability is what weighs on you most. He can be joyful and lucid for an hour, then dissolve into shouting fits so violent that furniture splinters and portraits tilt on their hooks. And you never know which version of him will come through the next door, or what he'll demand when he does. Some staff keep a list of phrases that seem to calm him. Others have developed a system of subtle signals for when it's time to fetch Willis, or clear the room, or simply duck. For your part, you've taken to watching his eyes. There's something in the way they shift, the way his pupils dilate or dart about the room, that gives you a second or two of warning. Sometimes it's enough, not always. This evening, as the sky darkens over Windsor, you're called to assist with preparing the king's private chapel for a prayer session he has requested. No one knows what kind of prayer it will be. Last week, he gave a sermon about horses ascending to heaven. The week before, he insisted everyone in attendance wear gloves, even the bishop. You gather the candles and straighten the kneelers, your footsteps echoing softly through the empty space. The king arrives shortly after sunset. He is calm, hair combed, coat buttoned, shoes on. For once, he walks slowly to the front of the chapel, pauses, and begins to hum, not a hymn, but a strange, slow lullaby. You recognize it. It's the same tune you heard him mumbling by the staircase days ago. Then he lifts his hands again and begins to speak, not to the room, but to the heavens. "Open the gates," he says, voice low. "Let the angels in." A long pause follows. They are ready. I have seen their armor and their tears. You remain in place, unsure if you should respond, unsure what it would mean to respond. No one moves. The candlelight flickers gently across the walls, dancing over the stained glass. It feels, just for a moment, like time has stopped, but then comes the trembling in his hand, the fingers that twist at the air, the look in his eye that goes glassy. You recognize it now, the beginning of another turn. And as the king begins to shout about thunder in his bones and visions in the candle wax, the physician is summoned again, and your role, whatever it's become, starts all over. By the time dawn breaks, he will have been restrained again. The chapel will be empty again, and you'll be standing outside his chambers, tray in hand, wondering whether the man behind those doors still remembers your face, or if he's already deep into another divine conversation. Either way, you'll be ready, because the treatments are about to begin again. And this time, they've brought in new methods, straps, powders, and a curious theory about freezing baths. They don't call them restraints. Not out loud, not in front of you, and certainly not in front of the queen. Among the physicians, they're referred to in euphemisms, supports, safety bands, preventatives. But when you carry the linen-wrapped bundle down the hallway and feel the weight of buckles and canvas shift in your arms, there's no doubt about what they really are. They're meant to hold a king still, to stop a man who rules an empire from hurting himself or anyone else while his mind refuses to obey its own commands. The orders come quickly that morning. Dr. Willis's assistant appears at your elbow while you're delivering. Tea to a lady in waiting. No eye contact. Just a whispered request. The green room. Now, bring warm water, linen, and the wrap kit. You nod and make your way down the hall, brushing past portraits of stiff, powdered ancestors who never had to be carried back to bed because they tried to climb out the window looking for stars. Inside the green room, it's already begun. The king is on the floor, one cheek pressed to the marble tiles, murmuring something about betrayal and bees. Two physicians kneel beside him, one holding his shoulder gently, the other scribbling notes with a quill that keeps catching on the parchment. You set the water down. One of them looks up and gestures toward the linen. You unfold it slowly, hands practiced now, and begin soaking strips in the warm bowl. The restraints, canvas, stiff and fraying from use, sit nearby like silent accusations. There's nothing royal about them. The king doesn't resist much. He's calmer than expected, more tired than anything. His fingers twitch, his eyes flicker open, and for a brief moment, he looks straight at you and says, "I'm afraid of what they'll do when I'm gone." Then he closes his eyes again, and the moment vanishes like breath on cold glass. You've learned how to wrap his arms so they won't chafe, how to adjust the bindings so his circulation isn't cut off. It's the kind of skill no one trains you for, but somehow you've picked it up. Like folding a napkin, like smoothing a sheet, like helping someone disappear behind a curtain of dignity while their world slips through their fingers. Once he's secured to the chaise, the physicians apply a tincture to his temples, something that smells sharply of alcohol and flowers, and begin their whispered debate. One insists this episode is different. Another thinks it's following a pattern. A third just wants to try the cold baths again. No one asks what you think, of course. You're only there to mop the sweat from his brow and change the linens when they soil. But you hear enough. You know that under all their theories and lurid voices, they're just as lost as he is. Dr. Willis finally enters, eyes tired, coat stained with ink and old tea. He speaks with authority, though you notice the way his jaw clenches when he sees the king's wrists bound again. Too soon, he mutters. It's returned too soon. You're dismissed quietly. No fanfare, no thanks. Just a nod and a wave, and you take your tray and leave. Outside, the corridors bustle with ordinary court life. Footsteps echo. A clerk carries a stack of letters. A noblewoman glides past in a rush of perfume and gossip. The world keeps spinning, even as part of it collapses behind locked doors. You try not to think about it too much. That's the advice you were given, by the butler, by other footmen, even by one of the cooks who's been here longer than the queen. Serve the tea. Don't serve your thoughts, she said once, cracking eggs with a speed that could shame an army. You've taken it to heart, mostly. But it gets harder when you're this close. The next time you see him, the king is sitting upright in a chair near the east window, hands folded neatly in his lap. He thanks you for the tea, asks after your family again, and mentions how lovely the sunrise is. You smile and answer politely, though you don't believe he remembers you. Still, he holds your gaze for a long time. The world is louder now, he says softly, even when everyone's quiet. You leave without replying. There's nothing to say that wouldn't sound foolish. Later that evening, over supper in the servants' hall, the talk is all about the foreign dignitary arriving next week. There's concern about what the king might say, or worse do, if his condition doesn't improve. There's been discussion of staging appearances, carefully managed encounters with controlled topics and pre-written questions. You've heard rumors that sometimes, when the situation grows too risky, a cousin is sent to appear in his place from a distance, just long enough for a bow and a nod. No one confirms it, but no one denies it either. The queen hasn't been seen in 2 days. You pass her door on your way to the linen room and hear nothing from inside. No servants speaking, no music, not even the rustle of skirts, only the quiet weight of waiting. It's said she prays constantly now, not just at morning or before supper, but all throughout the day, kneeling for hours. One maid claims she's seen the queen's knees bruised from the stone tiles. Another says she found a handkerchief embroidered with the king's name buried under the queen's pillow, soaked through from tears. Still, her public face remains composed. When she does appear, every inch of her posture is regal. Every word is measured. But there's a hardness behind her eyes that wasn't there before, something brittle and distant. People say she used to laugh, back before the first episode, before the babbling fits and the lost speeches and the endless whispers. Now, even her smiles feel rehearsed. You wonder what it must be like for her to stand beside a man who is alternately a stranger, a prophet, and a memory, and to pretend that he is always the same. To navigate a court where everyone watches her for signs of weakness. To wonder if history will remember her as strong or simply complicit. Word spreads by morning that another treatment is planned, this one involving freezing water. The idea, apparently, is to shock the humors back into alignment. You're assigned to carry towels and firewood for afterward. They'll wrap him up in warm sheets, let the heat chase away the madness. That's the hope, at least. You've stopped asking if the methods are working. The physicians never give a straight answer. Some believe. Some are pretending. Most are just hoping no one gets hurt. You light the fire in the bathing chamber, watching the flame curl around the logs like a beast settling in for sleep. The copper tub gleams in the lamplight, the water already sloshing with melting chunks of ice. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a punishment cell, not a royal castle. But then again, What part of this place feels truly royal anymore? He arrives in silence this time, flanked by 2 guards and a physician. He doesn't speak, doesn't resist, just steps into the freezing water with a soft gasp, then sits, trembling, lips blue. You want to look away, but something keeps your eyes there, something quiet and sad. Once, a few weeks ago, before the worst of it began, he told a story during supper. It was about a boy who believed he could catch sunlight in a jar. Everyone laughed. He laughed the hardest. But now, watching him shiver in that tub while the physician counts his pulse, you wonder if he wasn't talking about himself. Maybe he really believed he could trap clarity, if only for a moment, and hold it long enough to remember who he was. When it's over, you help lift him out, wrap him in blankets, and carry him gently to his chair. He thanks you, teeth chattering, says something about the purity of cold water and the sins it can scrub away, then falls asleep mid-sentence. You leave quietly, arms wet, sleeves soaked through. Behind you, the room still smells of metal and medicine. And somewhere deep in your chest, you carry a growing certainty. Whatever they're trying, it's not working. He's slipping further each time. The worst part is knowing that none of this stays hidden. Not really. Word travels. Letters find their way to London. Gossip drips like rain through the cracks in the roof of courtly dignity. And now, you've heard rumors the Prince of Wales is returning soon, whether invited or not. It begins with a silver cloche and a summons at dawn. You're barely awake when the knock comes, firm, deliberate. Far too early to be good news. The majordomo's assistant hands you the order with a grimace, as though merely relaying it has aged him a year. His Majesty has requested a formal breakfast, he mutters, for himself and 3 guests. He doesn't elaborate on who those guests might be. The paper in your hand simply reads, 4 place settings, full service. Dining room, a no delay. You don't ask questions. You just walk to the kitchens, collect the dishes, and begin the quiet process of pretending nothing is unusual. The staff has gotten good at that. They no longer pause when orders like this come through. They no longer trade glances when the menu includes 4 egg dishes and 6 types of jam, all for one man. You prepare the tea, lay out the toast in perfect symmetry, and polish each spoon until your face stares back, warped and uncertain from the silver. When you enter the dining room, the table is already set. Chairs pulled out, candles lit though it's daylight, fresh flowers arranged at the center. The king is seated at the head, hands folded, expression solemn. Across from him, the 3 remaining chairs sit conspicuously empty. You greet him as required. He nods in return. Then, as you pour his tea, he gestures to the seat nearest him and says, "You'll have to forgive Lord Frederick. He's always late, but his wit makes up for it." His voice is perfectly composed, almost regal. You try not to react. There is no Lord Frederick on today's guest list. There is no guest list at all. He turns to the other chairs in turn, nodding and offering pleasantries to their invisible occupants. "Miss Finch, your bonnet is delightful today." Then to the 3rd seat, "Do stop glaring, Edward. You've held that grudge long enough. We're here to eat, not argue." He chuckles softly to himself, then delicately spoons sugar into his tea. You stand motionless at the sideboard, watching a monarch host a ghostly breakfast as though it's the most natural event in the world. He lifts his fork, cuts into his eggs, and occasionally pauses to answer unheard comments. There's no frenzy to it, no manic energy, just a quiet, focused detachment, like a man caught between memories and hallucinations, unwilling or unable to distinguish one from the other. When the Queen arrives 15 minutes later, she does not flinch. She takes in the scene, her husband cheerfully addressing empty chairs, and says nothing. She simply walks to the window and stares out, arms crossed, silent. You notice the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingertips dig into her sleeves. but she holds the silence with a practiced grace. She does not interrupt him. She does not break the spell. Eventually, she turns and leaves without a word. The breakfast continues. He comments on the weather, tells a story about a hunting trip that likely never happened. At one point, he laughs so loudly that the footman outside opens the door in alarm. You wave him off before the king notices. Then, with perfect ceremony, George rises from his seat, lifts his teacup to no one in particular, and offers a toast. To the ones we miss, he says softly, and to the ones who still remember. His hand trembles slightly as he drinks. By mid-morning, the table is a mess of untouched plates and half-sipped tea. You step in to clear the dishes, careful not to disturb the arrangement too soon. The king has wandered to the window now, humming a tune you don't recognize. He seems peaceful, but there's a sadness clinging to him, like a coat he's forgotten how to remove. You find yourself wondering about the guests, these imagined companions of his lonely meal. Were they people he once knew? Were they creations of his illness, or old friends brought back by memory's cruel kindness? You'll never know. No one will. But the look on his face as he poured tea for Miss Finch and scolded Edward told you everything you needed. He wasn't acting, not pretending. He was trying to live in a world that still made sense to him, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. Later that day, whispers flutter through the corridors like wind through reeds. The Prince of Wales has arrived. You hear it first from the scullery maid, who overheard the stable boys talking. Then from one of the under-butlers, who saw a familiar carriage roll through the main gates. No official announcement has been made yet, but the tension in the castle shifts like the air before a storm. Doors close faster. Footsteps quicken. The Queen disappears entirely. And when you see him, His Royal Highness, the future George IV, it's like watching a portrait step down from its frame. He's heavier now than his portrait suggests. Louder, too. But every inch of him moves with practiced confidence. He strides through the halls with his entourage, eyes flicking over everything, judging silently. He smiles when he speaks, but it never touches his eyes. He does not ask to see his father, not right away. Instead, he meets with physicians, reviews documents, takes dinner with select members of Parliament. And everywhere he goes, he carries the air of inevitability, like someone who's been waiting in the wings so long he's memorized the play better than the lead. Your duties shift instantly. You're reassigned to the prince's service, at least for the time being. That means sharper uniforms, more polished shoes, and longer days spent tending to someone who doesn't see you unless you're too slow. He does not speak kindly. He does not shout either. He simply speaks as if you are furniture, expected to function, never expected to falter. He laughs once, over a game of cards, when someone jokes about the king's morning councils with the angels. The room erupts in uncomfortable laughter. You keep your face still. By the time the sun sets, you're back outside the king's chambers again, this time holding a smaller tray. Inside, the voices are muffled. You think you hear crying, but you can't be sure if it's him or someone reading to him. You do know this. The breakfast table has been cleared, the chairs pushed in. The guests have gone, whether they were ever there or not. And now, with the prince walking the same halls, and the queen hiding behind shut doors, you realize you're not just serving a sick man anymore. You're standing in the middle of a quiet war, one that will be fought with signatures and glances and midnight letters, but no less brutal for it. Tomorrow, the prince is scheduled to meet his father, privately, behind closed doors. You already know you'll be asked to stand outside. What you don't know is whether the king will recognize his son, or mistake him for another ghost. There was a time when her laughter echoed through these halls, not often, and never loudly, but enough. You used to hear it in passing, soft as a silk hem brushing across polished stone, a quiet ripple at court dinners, or the slight hitch in her breath when the king whispered some dry joke no one else dared to acknowledge. It wasn't the laughter of joy exactly, more like the sound of a woman determined to keep the world spinning by sheer grace and habit. But lately, that sound has vanished. Queen Charlotte doesn't smile anymore. Not at breakfast. Not during chapel. Not when the king recites Latin sonnets to invisible companions. Her mouth stays tight, her posture iron rod straight, her gaze locked on a horizon no one else can see. You've noticed the way her ladies whisper, behind gloved hands now, how they glance toward her, the way you might glance at a painting to check if it's still crooked. She walks the palace like a shadow of herself, passing through rooms without seeming to enter them. The queen's private rooms have grown quieter. You're summoned there less frequently, and when you are, it's for small, careful tasks, freshening the ink at her desk, delivering folded letters sealed with wax, so dark it looks black in the lamplight. Once, you caught a glimpse of one such letter opened briefly on her bureau. The words were small, tight, and pressed close together, as though someone had written them with trembling hands. You don't read letters, of course. That would be unthinkable. But you saw just enough to catch the phrase, "He no longer sees me." There are no physicians summoned to her side. No leeches, no tonics, no freezing cubs. Her illness, if you can call it that, is invisible, but no less present. It clings to her like perfume gone sour. The weariness in her eyes deepens with each episode, and even her dresses, once bright with intricate embroidery, have faded into darker palettes. She still attends chapel, still appears beside the king when protocol demands it. But now you see her lips move without sound. Prayers, maybe, or simply the act of speaking, just to remember what her own voice feels like. One evening, as you bring in a tray of tea, you find her seated beside the fireplace, hands clasped in her lap, staring into the flames as if they've just spoken her name. She doesn't look at you as you place the tray down. She simply says, "When we were first married, he used to speak of orchards." You pause, unsure whether she's addressing you or the fire. He said he would retire to the countryside one day, become a gardener, read Virgil in the shade. She lifts her eyes just once, and you nearly step backward from the force of what you see there. He was never meant to wear a crown, she says. He believed too much in its weight. You bow and leave her to her silence. Things worsen after the prince's visit. There are whispers of confrontation, of voices raised behind locked doors, of chairs scraped harshly against polished floors. No one confirms it outright, but the staff knows how to read the signs. The prince no longer lingers after meetings. His visits are short, sharp, and followed by an uptick in correspondence. The queen, meanwhile, becomes even more withdrawn. At meals, she picks at her food with surgical disinterest. At services, she does not sing. She hasn't taken her husband's hand in public in weeks. You begin to notice the shift in how others speak of her. Less reverence, more distance, as if her grief has made her too fragile to approach. Or worse, too inconvenient to engage. Her influence, once quiet but undeniable, is slowly evaporating in the presence of her son's growing power. The court follows the warmth of proximity, and right now, the prince casts the longest shadow. One afternoon, while delivering new linen to the queen's quarters, you find one of her ladies-in-waiting crying in the corridor. She turns quickly when she hears your footsteps, wipes her eyes, and pretends to search for something in her reticule. She doesn't speak to us anymore. She murmurs without looking up. She walks the rooms like she's already in mourning. The queen has begun refusing portraits. An artist, summoned for an anniversary commission, is turned away twice. When she finally agrees to sit, it's for no more than 10 minutes. And when you pass the room, you glimpse her seated in a stiff-backed chair, gaze unfocused, with a half-finished embroidery hoop in her lap and no thread in the needle. The palace itself seems to reflect her withdrawal. Candles burn lower. Windows remain shuttered longer. Even the staff speaks in quieter tones. You hear fewer jokes in the kitchen, fewer songs hummed by scullery maids. It's as if the very air in Windsor is thickened with grief. A grief no one is allowed to name out loud. Some say she still visits the king alone, late at night, when the halls are quiet and the household asleep. You've never witnessed it, but you've seen the subtle signs. Her slippers by the door, a candle burned low in the hallway, a scent of rosewater lingering faintly near the king's chamber the next morning. If she does visit, she doesn't speak of it, and no one dares ask. When she does appear in public, it's with a new edge, a certain formality that cuts rather than comforts. She nods at courtiers like a queen carved from marble, no longer smiling, no longer soft, just present. And even that, barely. You notice how the king calls for her less frequently now. Not out of disinterest, but perhaps because he no longer remembers to. Sometimes he asks after someone by a different name. Sometimes he refers to her as though she were still a young bride. And sometimes, not at all. The few times they are seen together, it feels like watching two ships drifting past one another in the fog, aware of each other's presence, but unable to connect. The final time you see her smile, it's not for him. It's for a child. One of the page's sons brought briefly into court for a ceremony. The queen bends down, adjusts the child's collar, and offers him a quiet word. Something private, something small. The boy grins, and for the briefest instant, she mirrors it. A flicker, gone almost as soon as it arrives. That night, as you prepare the king's bedroom for another restless evening, you notice a change. The physicians have brought in new charts. The bed has been moved slightly, angled now to face the window rather than the door. One of the attendants asks you to place a potted plant by the sill. He's been asking about orchards, the man says. Says he hears apples falling outside. The queen does not visit that evening. She won't the next either. Instead, word arrives that she has taken rooms elsewhere in the castle, farther from the king's chambers, closer to the private chapel. No explanation is given. None is needed. The silence between them is now official. And as you finish folding the king's linens, listening to him murmur names you no longer recognize, you can't help but wonder, if the queen has stopped smiling, what else has she let go of? And what happens to a household, no, an empire, when the center of its quiet strength no longer believes the man wearing the crown can ever come back? You'll find out soon, because a letter has arrived from Parliament, and it's addressed not to the king, but to the Prince of Wales. The air inside Windsor has changed, not in the way weather shifts with the seasons, but in something deeper, something that settles beneath the paint, behind the paneling, into the bones of the building itself. You feel it in the way conversations pause at doorways, in the way even the marble seems to echo more darkly beneath your steps. There's no need to ask what's coming. It's already arrived. Everyone just pretends it hasn't. The fiction of recovery no longer holds. At first, when the king's episodes began, there were reassurances, a cycle of polite optimism that promised every new treatment would be the one to restore him. But the hope has worn thin. Now the physicians arrive with more charts than questions, and the linen boys don't even ask what to fetch. No one speculates whether His Majesty will improve. They speak only of how long the next episode might last. The illusion of a king ruling from within these walls has become too heavy to lift. Outside the king's wing, power has found a new shape. The Prince of Wales moves with increasing certainty, and his influence is no longer whispered, it is assumed. He holds audiences with ministers in broad daylight. He selects music for palace events and approves royal correspondence without blinking. He occupies spaces his father once commanded with reverent distance. The change is quiet, but undeniable. You see it in the way courtiers adjust their tone when speaking his name, and in how quickly even the most loyal begin aligning themselves with the rising tide. The language of the household has shifted. His Majesty now refers to the prince more often than the king, and no one corrects it. You exist in a peculiar in-between, still part of the old order, but increasingly folded into the new. You carry trays to both wings of the palace, serve 2 generations of monarchs whose gazes never meet. The king greets you with phrases that slip sideways, questions that don't fit the moment. Some days he calls you Thomas, some days William. You answer to both. It's easier that way. Once, while laying out his nightclothes, he asked if the war was over yet. No one knew which war he meant. The prince, by contrast, is sharply present. He does not ask questions. He gives directives. His eyes linger too long on weaknesses, and his silences carry meaning that others rush to interpret. You've seen grown men stammer in his presence, their confidence unraveling under the weight of his approval withheld. The staff's posture has changed around him, more alert, more rigid, like dogs waiting for a command. There's no room for the kind of mistakes the old king would have forgiven with a distracted nod. Under the prince, error becomes spectacle, and spectacle has consequences. There's a rhythm to your days now. One half of the palace floats in confusion, wrapped in murmurs and candle smoke. The other beats with calculation and the faint scent of cologne. In one wing, the king is fed boiled eggs and speaks to his reflection. In the other, the prince debates naval policy over pork and venison. The division is not marked on any map, but everyone knows exactly where it lies. Even your own footsteps change depending on which hallway you're walking. One morning, you're asked to deliver a message to the prince's secretary. As you pass through the corridor outside the drawing room, you hear laughter, sharp, controlled, the kind that's rehearsed. Inside, the prince sits at a gaming table, surrounded by ministers pretending to enjoy themselves. You're waved off quickly. The message is not urgent enough. You're told, and you should return later. As you walk away, you hear the prince ask whether Parliament will finally do what must be done. No one answers, but the silence feels like agreement. That evening, you return to the king's chambers. The man who once signed the death warrants of rebels now stares at his fingers as if seeing them for the first time. He hums an unfamiliar tune. His shoes are mismatched again. You help him to bed, adjust his pillows, and turn down the lamp. Just before sleep, he mumbles something that sounds like, "Tell Charlotte, I remembered." You nod, though you don't know what he means. The next day brings snow. The windows frost over, and the fires are lit earlier. In the prince's quarters, there are preparations for a banquet. New guests arrive, men in coats with military buttons, women in jewels that glint too sharply in the candlelight. Their laughter echoes in the gallery. Meanwhile, the queen remains in her private rooms. Her absence from the banquet is noted, but not discussed. It's become easier for everyone to pretend she is simply resting. Rumors now flow freely. They say a new Regency bill is being drawn, that Parliament will soon make the arrangement official, that the prince will no longer need to speak through proxies or scribble behind locked doors. Some say he's already chosen his new staff. Others claim he's made promises to foreign ambassadors. You try to ignore it all, but it's difficult when the ink on every parchment smells fresher than the dust in the throne room. You hear less and less from the physicians. The king's care has become routine. No new treatments. No new theories. The most recent suggestion, to expose him to open air more frequently, resulted in the king mistaking a trellis for a harp and trying to play it with a shoehorn. You helped guide him back inside, gently, without speaking. Later, he thanked you for saving his life, though from what, he couldn't explain. The palace has become a stage with 2 spotlights and no script. You watch them both, the fading monarch and the rising prince. One trapped in echoes, the other roaring into his reflection. Neither sees you, not really, but you remain, tray in hand, steps measured, eyes forward. Because service, even in this strange twilight, still demands its rituals. And then, just before the end of the year, you see the letter. It is not meant for you, of course, but you glimpse it as you help the undersecretary sort a stack of correspondence outside the prince's study. Heavy parchment, deep crimson seal, the mark of Parliament pressed clean into the wax. Its contents are not read aloud, but the Undersecretary's face says everything. He bows low as he carries it through the doors. The prince will be regent in name, not just practice. The crown remains on the king's brow, but power has shifted in full. There is no fanfare, no trumpets, just a quiet closing of doors and the rearranging of chairs at supper. The change comes like snowfall, gradual, soft, but impossible to ignore. The king still prays, still hums, still smiles sometimes when you bring his tea, but fewer eyes turn toward him now. He has become a figure preserved in form, but removed from function. A name stamped on coins and whispered in churches, while his son makes the decisions that matter. And so the walls of Windsor continue to hold him, like a shrine that no one visits, while beyond those walls, history begins to move again. The war in Europe rages. Ministers argue. Empires shift. But here, inside the velvet-trimmed silence, time thickens like syrup. Eventually, you stop wondering if he'll return to himself. Not because you've given up, but because the world has already moved on. What lingers now is not hope, but habit. The sound of slippers on cold stone. The hush of curtains drawn at dusk. The quiet rhythm of routine for a king who once held an empire and now listens only to voices no one else hears. And behind it all, there's a deeper story. One that began long before the madness, before the restraints and whispered prayers. A story that winds through triumph and fear, through colonies lost and sons resented, through duty, obsession, and the slow erosion of a mind no longer able to bear the weight of a crown. That story begins with a young man called George, a farmer at heart, crowned too early and watched too closely. And it's time we followed him there. Before the tremors, before the whispers and closed doors, before the shadows lengthened over Windsor, there was just George. Not the king, not the madman, not the man buried under layers of velvet, incense, and ceremony. Just George, a young man in a stiff wig and tightly tailored coat, adjusting his cuffs and reciting Latin in the echoing chambers of Leicester House, where ambition hung in the air like the scent of old books and boiled tea. You could almost picture him in that quieter time, pacing the garden paths, hands clasped behind his back, face turned toward the clouds. His mind is sharp, curious. He asks questions others avoid. He reads about crop rotations and Roman emperors with equal fascination. They call him dull behind closed doors, too serious, too devoted to propriety. But they don't see the restless energy under the calm surface. He wants to do it right, to be better than those who came before him, to be a good king, not just a powerful one. When his grandfather, George II, finally dies in 1760, the weight of the crown lands squarely on his young shoulders. He's only 22. The empire stretches across oceans, from Korean sugar plantations to the trading ports of Bengal. At home, Parliament squabbles, ministers bicker, the press whispers about scandal, as it always does. And now, all eyes turn to him, the boy they called Farmer George for his plain tastes and countryside habits. He doesn't mind the nickname. If anything, he embraces it. He prefers gardens to ballrooms, prefers quiet devotion to showy indulgence. Where his grandfather reveled in German militarism and thick accents, George speaks perfect English and prides himself on frugality. He's the first monarch in decades who was born and raised in Britain, who sees himself as British before anything else. It's a novelty that earns him loyalty from some skepticism from others. The old aristocracy watches him carefully, unsure what to make of a king who avoids gambling tables and speaks of morality as if it actually matters. Still, he ascends the throne with remarkable composure. The coronation is lavish, as all coronations must be, but there's a stiffness to him that people notice. He stands too straight, his face too still. He seems to carry the ceremony like a suit too tight for comfort. But underneath the golden robes and ritual, he is determined. He writes his own speech to Parliament. He insists on frugality in court spending. He chooses advisors not just for pedigree, but for character. He marries Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, not for politics, but because she is modest, intelligent, and unlikely to interfere. Within 6 hours of meeting, they are married. Their partnership, surprisingly, works. He is not perfect. He is not warm. But he is committed. In a palace built on convenience and compromise, his seriousness stands out. At first, this new reign seems like a clean page, a chance to realign the monarchy with virtue, responsibility, and reason. George throws himself into governance. He reviews financial ledgers, drafts correspondence, and meddles in appointments far more than his predecessors ever dared. Some ministers resent him for it. Others find themselves suddenly promoted if they align with his vision. He does not rule from a distance. He involves himself directly, sometimes to a fault. He is also deeply, almost obsessively, religious. Every morning begins with prayer. Every decision is weighed, not just in political terms, but moral ones. He views his kingship as a divine duty, a sacred trust. And while that lends a certain nobility to his efforts, it also isolates him. The world he governs is far messier than the sermons he hears each Sunday. In private, he is strict. He believes in order, in restraint, in doing one's duty without complaint. His children are raised under a firm hand. Tutors are instructed to spare no rod. His sons grow to fear him more than they admire him. His daughters, educated carefully, are kept close, their movements limited. To him, the family is an extension of the kingdom, a structure to be maintained, not questioned. Yet there are glimpses of warmth. He walks his gardens at Kew in plain clothes. He greets servants by name. He sketches landscapes in the margins of his letters, and once spent an entire afternoon trying to coax a wounded bird to take seed from his poem. These are moments no painter ever captures, but they are real, and they matter, if only because they contrast so sharply with what will come. The early years of his reign are marked by tension. He wants to reign in Parliament's power without alienating the very ministers he needs. He pushes for loyalty, for efficiency, for dignity. But politics has little patience for righteousness. His insistence on controlling appointments earns him accusations of tyranny. His German heritage, though distant, becomes a convenient cudgel for critics to use against him. The press begins to poke. Caricatures of a stiff, awkward king appear in pamphlets and shop windows. They mock his plainness, his formality, his refusal to engage in the vices so common at court. But George does not bend. He will not be the kind of king who drifts through his reign on parade floats and polite applause. He believes in doing things the hard way, even if it makes him unpopular, even if it means losing sleep, even if it leads slowly and quietly to the kind of pressure that starts to fracture a mind already predisposed to fragility. Because that's the thing about George. He holds everything too tightly. His ideals, his dignity, his sense of control. He does not delegate easily. He does not vent. And the responsibilities of empire, the taxes, the rebellions, the infighting among lords who never carry their own pens, those responsibilities do not lessen. They multiply. And George, ever dutiful, never asks for help. The weight begins to show. He wakes earlier, eats less, paces longer in the evenings. He writes letters deep into the night, sometimes pages and pages without pause. His handwriting grows more jagged. His sentences ramble. Ministers whisper about exhaustion. His own advisors begin to wonder how long he can keep this pace. But no one dares say so aloud. Not yet. What you see in these early years is a man trying to hold up a palace on his own shoulders, convinced that any crack is proof of moral failure. He does not yet see that the cracks are forming anyway. And even if he did, he wouldn't stop. For a time, he manages to hold everything together: family, parliament, empire, self. But soon, the outer world will begin to shift in ways no amount of discipline can reverse. Across the ocean, smoke is rising from colonial streets. Riots, protests, speeches of defiance. He watches with growing unease. These are not petty squabbles, he insists. These are betrayals. He believes, down to the last quill stroke, that he can hold the colonies. That loyalty will win out. That rebellion is something that happens to other kings. But history is not interested in his ideals. It has already begun to move without him. And while George prepares speeches and sermons, others are preparing ships. It starts, as so many things do, with paper. Pamphlets, petitions, declarations, all drifting across the Atlantic, like embers caught in a draft. On one side of the ocean, British ministers sharpen their arguments with powdered wigs and brandy. On the other, farmers and lawyers sign their names to bold, treasonous words. In the middle stands George, still certain he can smother the fire with law, with order, with carefully worded reminders of loyalty. He does not yet understand that the fire has already taken root, and that no parchment will stop what comes next. You watch the court shift as tension rises. Letters from the colonies arrive weekly now, each carrying news worse than the last. First, it's unrest in Boston, then outright rebellion. British troops march through unfamiliar forests, and ministers begin drawing red lines across maps none of them have ever seen firsthand. You hear the arguments in corridors and drawing rooms, men shouting about taxes and tea, about honor and sovereignty. But beneath all the rhetoric lies a simpler truth. The empire is slipping, and the king refuses to let go. George takes it personally. He sees the American unrest not as a failure of policy, but a betrayal. These are his subjects, his empire. He cannot imagine a world in which loyalty is not owed, in which royal authority is not final. He views the colonies the way he views his own children, dependent, disobedient, but still family. When they reject Parliament's taxes, he offers compromise. When they resist soldiers, he offers warning. But when they declare independence, he hardens like frost over glass. The break is no longer just political, it's emotional. And in George's mind, it is treason in its purest, most unforgivable form. Behind closed doors, the ministers begin to hedge their bets. Some advocate a firm military response. Others urge negotiation. But George is resolved. There will be no tolerance for rebellion. He believes that to back down now is to signal weakness, not only to the colonies, but to the world. France, Spain, the Dutch, everyone is watching. If Britain can't control its provinces, what's left of the empire's dignity? He fears that if the colonies succeed, the whole imperial edifice could crack and tumble. You hear him speak of duty with increasing fervor. He reads military reports late into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat. He pores over accounts of skirmishes in places he cannot pronounce. He fixates on names: Washington, Adams, Franklin, as if by understanding them, he can reverse their course. In his letters, the tone shifts. The calm, deliberate hand gives way to sharp edges and underlined words. His grammar slips. His sentences begin to stretch like unspooled thread. Still, he insists on being seen. He attends Parliament, delivers speeches with clear conviction. To the outside world, he remains composed, a king leading a war effort. But inside Windsor, the strain begins to leak through. You notice it in small ways. He forgets appointments, repeats himself, leaves the same room twice in a row. His physicians whisper about exhaustion. His servants start leaving extra notes tucked into his correspondence. Reminders for the basics: eat, sleep, pray. When news arrives of Saratoga, the mood darkens. A British army defeated. Parliament rattles. Ministers resign. You see the king more often in the chapel now, head bowed for longer than usual. He prays for victory, for wisdom, for clarity. But what he receives instead is silence. And then the French enter the war. It's a shift the court feels instantly, like the floor giving way beneath a crowded room. This is no longer a matter of colonial unrest. Now it's a global struggle. France brings ships, troops, and most importantly, legitimacy to the American cause. What once seemed a domestic inconvenience has become an international humiliation. George redoubles his efforts. More letters, more generals, more proclamations calling for courage and sacrifice. But you can sense the desperation beneath the rhetoric. The war is no longer about preserving the colonies. It's about salvaging pride. He begins to isolate himself more, walks in the garden alone, speaks less at dinner. Once you pass him in the hallway and hear him muttering numbers under his breath. Lists of regiments, casualty counts, ships deployed. He does not acknowledge you. His mind is elsewhere, pacing the battlefields of a continent he's never seen. When Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, the news arrives folded in silk and silence. No announcements are made. No court bells ring. But within hours, the mood in the palace shifts. The prince is quiet. The queen says little. The ministers no longer rush to George's study with suggestions. There's nothing left to suggest. You bring him tea that afternoon. He doesn't touch it. He sits with the letter in his lap, unfolded but unread. He stares at the same point on the wall for what feels like an hour. Then, without looking up, he says softly, "They are gone." You're not sure whether he's speaking to you, to himself, or to some memory of a world that no longer exists. After that, something in him changes. He doesn't stop governing, doesn't retreat from court, but a layer peels away, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. The press, once wary of criticizing royalty, now moves more boldly. Caricatures show the king blinded by stubbornness, wrapped in chains of his own making. Some even suggest he should abdicate. You see one such pamphlet left behind on a chair and are shocked by the brutality of it. His face drawn in wild, exaggerated lines, mouth open in a scream no one hears. George doesn't respond publicly, but those close to him notice the withdrawal. He writes more, sleeps less. His thoughts seem to spiral in on themselves. At one council meeting, he repeats the same point 3 times, each time phrased slightly differently. No one corrects him. They all nod as if nothing is amiss. You begin to notice strange patterns. He wears the same coat 2 days in a row. He forgets to sign letters. Once, he stands alone in the middle of a hallway and asks whether it's Sunday or Tuesday. When you gently tell him it's Friday, he smiles as if you've delivered a blessing. The loss of America is not just a political defeat. It is, for George, a shattering of worldview. His belief in divine monarchy, in inherited duty, in moral order, everything that shaped his identity is thrown into question. He cannot comprehend how loyalty failed. He cannot see the rebellion as anything but personal. And while the war's cost drains the treasury and morale, the true toll is harder to measure. You see it in his eyes, in the long pauses between sentences, in the sudden shifts from clarity to confusion. Ministers whisper that he's overworked. Physicians recommend rest. But the king refuses both. He continues, driven more by compulsion than purpose, like a wheel that cannot stop spinning even as it wobbles. In time, the empire will adjust. New colonies will rise. Trade routes will shift. Britain will eventually move on. But George will not. For him, America is not a chapter. It is the beginning of a fracture, one that cannot be repaired with treaties or taxes. He still believes in the crown, but the weight of it, once noble, now presses down like lead. And as the years pass, that weight will grow heavier, dragging his mind further from shore. Even now, before the first real episode, before the restraints and the whispered prayers, the signs are there. The flickers, the tremors, the restless pacing at midnight. And somewhere deep inside, the first quiet panic that maybe, just maybe, he is not holding it together as well as he believes. He tries to build something solid within the walls, something untouchable by rebellion or ridicule. George's solution, once the colonies are gone and Parliament grows unrulier by the session, is to turn inward to the family. He becomes not just a king, but a father with a plan. The world outside might spiral into instability, but his household will follow rules, structure, harmony. If the nation is noisy, then the palace will be quiet. If loyalty crumbles abroad, then he will forge it at home. That's the hope, at least. He has 15 children. 15. And he believes in raising them personally, not through distant tutors and occasional royal nods. Every moment is scheduled, every lesson tracked, every behavior corrected. The boys rise early, read scripture, learn mathematics and military drills before breakfast. The girls practice piano, languages, embroidery, and above all, silence. No outbursts, no contradiction, no deviation from what he defines as virtue. He is firm in everything. His children address him with formality, even at supper. One wrong look earns them an hour of lecturing, or an icy glance that leaves them trembling long after the meal is done. You pass them often in the palace halls. Their footsteps fall evenly on the stone floors, always paired with a governess or guard. They never laugh too loudly. They don't run, even the youngest. Occasionally, you catch a glimpse of mischief in one of the boys. A moment of rebellion flickering like a candle, but it dies quickly under the weight of expectation. The king is always nearby, watching, measuring, correcting. They are not just children to him. They are symbols of stability, living proof that he still commands order in a world increasingly disinterested in being ordered. The queen assists where she can. She is patient, calm, unfailingly dutiful, but she too has limits. As the family grows, so do the pressures. Each birth brings new complications. Each child another responsibility, added to a tower already too high. And George, for all his righteousness, does not make it easy. He rarely praises. He demands perfection and is surprised when fear grows in the place of affection. In public, the royal family appears pristine. They sit for portraits with practiced stillness, daughters in lace, sons in miniature military coats. The king speaks fondly of their virtues to Parliament. Newspapers write admiring pieces about the royal household. How noble, how wholesome, how perfectly English. But behind the scenes, the cracks are there. You see them every day. One child whispers a question and is met with stone silence. Another is corrected so sharply for an offhand remark that he weeps into his sleeve for 20 minutes afterward. Still, no one intervenes. It isn't cruelty, not exactly. It's something colder, something structured like discipline, but shaped like distance. The eldest sons bear it worst of all. George, Prince of Wales, the heir, grows up in a gilded cage of his father's design. He is groomed to be the next monarch, but never trusted with independence. Every friendship is monitored, every expense audited, every ambition treated with suspicion. He wants to dance, to drink, to dress like a peacock, to court actresses and duel poets. George wants none of it. Frivolous, he calls it, wasteful. The boy learns to lie before he learns to shave. You watch the tension unfold in glances across drawing rooms, in tight-lipped smiles during public ceremonies. The prince begins to speak more freely when his father is absent, ridiculing the restrictions, mimicking the lectures. Others laugh nervously. The court is still loyal to the crown, but loyalty does not prevent observation, and anyone with eyes can see it. The future king is beginning to hate the present one. The other children, each in their own way, buckle under the weight of proximity to their father. Some withdraw entirely, speaking only when spoken to. Others act out in small, quiet ways, sneaking novels, passing notes, singing too loudly when they think no one is listening. But even these rebellions feel hollow. The palace is too tightly wound. Everything is tracked, noted, reported. Even your footsteps echo a little differently when the king is near. He means well, and that's part of the tragedy. He truly believes he's doing right by them, that by enforcing morality and order, he's protecting them from the chaos of the world. But what he's built isn't a haven, it's a mirror of his own anxiety. He teaches virtue, but not tenderness. He insists on obedience, but not understanding. And the result is a family that performs love rather than feels it. There are moments, though, quiet ones, where you catch a glimpse of something softer. One evening, you find the king alone in the nursery, holding one of the younger children's toys. A small wooden horse, chipped at the edges. He turns it over in his hands like it's a sacred object. When he notices you, he sets it down quickly, clears his throat, and says nothing. Another time, you hear him playing a hymn on the harpsichord, slowly, his fingers faltering over the keys. The room is empty. No one hears it but you and the dust. The older he gets, the more isolated he becomes within his own household. His sons avoid him. His daughters fear him. And the queen, though still devoted, no longer tries to soften his expectations. She has learned, perhaps, that love does not soften a wall. It merely bruises the hand that knocks against it too often. One daughter, Amelia, is different. She remains his favorite. She has his eyes, his smile, his sense of dignity. He trusts her in ways he does not trust the others. When she falls ill, everything in him begins to unravel more quickly. You notice it first in his posture. He walks with less purpose, forgets his gloves, fumbles names. Then come the ramblings, the pacing, the letters written at odd hours. When Amelia dies, his grief is unbearable, not just for the loss of her, but because she was the last thread holding his image of himself together. The dutiful father, the moral king, the family man. All of it begins to slip. And so the palace grows quieter. The children leave, marry, quarrel. The prince grows louder, brasher, and more openly contemptuous. The queen draws further into herself. And the king, once surrounded by a great family of his own design, finds himself standing in the middle of it with no one left who dares to meet his eyes. You bring him tea one morning and find him sitting in silence, watching the door as if expecting someone who never arrives. He doesn't speak. He just looks past you, through you, to something you can't see. Maybe a memory. Maybe a daughter. Maybe just the ghost of who he thought he'd be. Soon, the strain of holding the family together will give way to something else. Something deeper. Something darker. And as his children turn away, the parliament will turn inward, watching closely as their sovereign begins to slip. The king's body still walks the corridors, but the fractures are growing. In the family, in the palace, in the mind behind the crown. And when the next death comes, one not of kin, but of clarity, it will shake the very structure of power itself. It doesn't happen all at once. There is no single day when the king wakes up and forgets who he is. No shattering moment where the court gasps and history pivots. Instead, it creeps in quietly, like frost working its way along the edges of a pane. A name forgotten here, a phrase repeated there. At first, the servants simply chalk it up to exhaustion. The ministers blame overwork. The queen, ever composed, suggests more rest, fewer engagements. But behind closed doors, those closest to the king begin to feel something shift. You notice it yourself during the morning preparations. He speaks to you more now, not with the firm confidence of a ruler giving instruction, but with the strange intimacy of a man who cannot tell which decade he's standing in. One morning, as you arrange the brushes near his dressing table, he asks how your father is recovering from the war wound. You pause confused. Your father has never been in battle, but he's already moved on. rambling about horses and lightning and the strange smell of the Thames in spring. He seems lucid most of the time, still capable of charm, of clarity. He greets guests with the appropriate titles, delivers speeches with careful precision. But the in-between moments grow stranger. He paces at night, muttering strings of numbers under his breath. He forgets that one of his daughters has moved away and grows furious when she fails to attend supper. Once, you find him standing at the end of a corridor, pressing his palm to the wall, eyes closed, as if listening for something inside the stones. The physicians are concerned, but cautious. They recommend less correspondence, shorter audiences, lighter reading. The king ignores all of it. He writes late into the night, sometimes 14 pages in a single sitting. He quotes the Psalms and Greek philosophy, sometimes within the same paragraph. The sentences spiral. He no longer pauses between thoughts. You hear him reading aloud behind the door, an unbroken stream of speech that seems less like communication and more like incantation. And then comes the letter. It's from Charlotte, a private note to the royal physician, slipped into his hand during an otherwise ordinary evening. You see him pale as he reads it. He folds it carefully, tucks it into his coat, and leaves without finishing his wine. That night, 4 additional physicians are summoned. The next morning, the king is not present at breakfast. No explanation is offered. Over the next several days, the pattern becomes undeniable. His temper flares unpredictably. He begins shouting at portraits. He accuses footmen of betrayal, claiming they've been bribed by foreign powers. During a meeting with his ministers, he suddenly begins singing loudly, joyfully, completely unprovoked. The room falls silent, and no one dares interrupt. When the song ends, he simply nods and says, "That will do," as if nothing unusual has occurred. He no longer sleeps through the night. You hear him pacing the garden paths well past midnight, talking to himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. He eats less. His hands shake. His gaze, once direct and measured, now floats somewhere just past your shoulder, as if watching something you cannot see. One afternoon, the queen finds him sitting on the floor of the drawing room, surrounded by documents and torn letters. He's stripped off his coat and is reciting laws from memory, pausing only to scribble nonsense in the margins of official reports. When she gently suggests he rest, he screams, not words, just noise, deep and guttural. It echoes down the corridors like a wounded animal, and you see servants flinch as they pretend not to hear. A new physician arrives from Oxford. He examines the king for several hours, then emerges, pale and rattled. He does not speak to the press. He speaks only to the queen and a single member of the Privy Council. Whatever is discussed behind those doors remains private, but something in the atmosphere changes. The whispers grow louder, the glances more urgent, and suddenly, people begin to use the word madness. Not officially, not in any documents or decrees, but it slips between the marble pillars and velvet curtains like smoke. His Majesty is unwell. The king is indisposed. You hear it everywhere now, under breath, in coded phrases. Among servants, the fear is different. Less political, more personal. No one wants to be the one in the room when he lashes out. No one wants to be responsible for spilling tea when he's rambling about betrayal and celestial choirs. The queen attempts to hold everything together. She organizes smaller suppers, invites fewer guests, posts guards outside his chamber, not for security, but for containment. You pass her once in the corridor and are struck by the stillness of her expression, unmoving, unreadable, as if carved from porcelain. She offers you a tight nod. You return it and carry on. Then one day, he disappears. Not in the literal sense. He's still within the palace, but no one can find him. He's not in his study, not in the chapel, not in the gardens. It takes nearly 2 hours before a young page finds him in the old music room, lying beneath the harpsichord. He is weeping quietly, his shirt stained with ink, his fingers smudged with charcoal. When asked what he's doing, he replies, "I'm waiting for the angels to finish tuning." They move him back to his room, gently, carefully. No restraints yet. Not this time. But the decision is made. He will no longer appear in public until further notice. You're present later that evening when Dr. Willis arrives. He speaks with calm authority, introduces himself without pomp. He asks for detailed notes on the king's recent behavior, orders changes in diet and routine, and sets strict rules for who may interact with His Majesty. For the first time, you hear the word episode used officially. The king, unaware of these developments, spends the night writing. You bring him tea at dawn and see the pages stacked beside him, more than 20, dense and scrawled. He offers you one with a smile, says, "Read this carefully. It contains the solution to death." You don't read it, but you keep it anyway, folded and tucked into your pocket. The episodes come faster now, shorter, sharper. He bursts into tears mid-sentence, forgets names. Then, just as suddenly, he returns to clarity, quoting Virgil and inquiring about the weather. These moments of lucidity are almost worse. They give hope. They make the collapse feel like a mistake, like something that can be reversed. But it always returns. The fog, the rambling, the wild eyes, and sudden joy that ends in panic. Soon, even the ministers accept what the physicians have already concluded. The king is no longer fit to rule alone. Discussions begin in private chambers, behind double-locked doors. They speak of regency, of duty, of preserving the dignity of the throne, while ensuring governance continues. The Prince of Wales grows more visible, more confident. He is no longer just a son. He is a shadow waiting for the sun to set. And all the while, the king paces. He paces the corridors in slippers and ink-stained cuffs. He lectures the wallpaper. He speaks to people who are not there. And through it all, you remain nearby, holding the tray, lighting the candles, changing the linens, bearing witness to the slow, painful cracking of a crown. But the real fracture is still to come. Because soon, this private unraveling will become a public crisis. Parliament will be forced to act. The court will divide. And George, once seen as the embodiment of order, will become a symbol of instability. The quiet fall of a man will give way to the noisy scramble of an empire trying to decide who rules next. The whispers spill out into daylight. For weeks, they had stayed tucked behind drawing room curtains and within footmen's quarters, murmured over ledgers and behind folded fans. But in November of 1788, the palace can no longer contain them. What began as a private ordeal now surges into the corridors of Parliament and echoes through every street in London. The king is ill, the ministers are divided, and the kingdom, well, the kingdom is waiting, watching, and wondering who is actually in charge. You're there for the first official breach of decorum. It's a bitter morning, frost blooming on the edges of the garden paths, when the king is due to meet with a delegation. The air is sharp, the corridors cold. You carry a tray of tea and documents into the drawing room, expecting only the usual silence and soft warnings from his attendants. But instead, you find him kneeling on the floor, muttering about lost ships, his fingertips smeared with ink, and the corners of a map folded in unnatural ways. When the delegation enters behind you, he does not rise. He simply waves the map at them and whispers, "I've found where the stars are stored." The room goes quiet. No one moves. The silence is long and awkward enough to age the portraits on the walls. Eventually, someone coughs. You're ushered out quickly. The tea forgotten. The documents left cooling on a side table. That afternoon, the newspapers print nothing, but the city knows anyway. By nightfall, coffee houses are packed with voices speculating about everything from abdication to divine punishment. The political crisis takes form almost instantly. Parliament is already on edge after years of war debt and colonial loss. The idea that the king might be incapacitated is not just alarming, it's destabilizing. Ministers panic. Royalists circle the wagons. Reformists sharpen their knives. And in the middle of it all, the Prince of Wales hovers like a hawk just out of reach. He does not claim power. Not yet. But he stops pretending not to want it. You overhear more than you should. It's impossible not to. The palace is swollen with political visitors now. Lords, lawyers, bishops, physicians. Every sitting room becomes a war council. Every hallway a trap for wandering ears. The term Regency is uttered dozens of times each hour. No one agrees on how to do it. Some say it must be formalized through law. Others argue the prince has the right by blood alone. Meanwhile, the king's condition worsens by the day. He begins to refuse food. He walks the halls in the middle of the night, reciting entire pages from obscure legal texts. He insists that he has spoken to angels, that the throne of heaven is currently unoccupied and must be filled. He demands to be taken to Hanover before the rivers catch fire. And through it all, the doctors argue amongst themselves. One recommends restraint and dark rooms. Another demands more drastic intervention. A third insists they have made progress, even as the king forgets how to hold a spoon. The queen cannot intervene. She is no longer permitted to sit with him unaccompanied. His outbursts have become unpredictable, and once, just once, he raised his hand mid-rant and struck the table so hard it splintered. She left the room without a word, but you saw her later, seated at her writing desk, staring into a candle that had long since burned out. That night, her ladies remove every mirror from her apartments. No one asks why. Eventually, Parliament moves forward with a plan. The Regency bill is drafted. Heated debates erupt over how much power the prince should hold. Some argue he must be king in all but name. Others insist his actions must be tightly regulated. The king is still alive, after all, still wears the crown. But what value is a crown on the head of a man who cannot tell 1 hour from the next? The prince does nothing to calm the storm. He waits, basks in the attention, plays host to allies and critics alike. He wears regal colors now, holds court in private salons, and lets his supporters call him Your Highness, with just a shade more emphasis. He claims loyalty to his father, of course. He speaks of duty, of compassion, of stepping in only to preserve the realm. But his ambition glows behind every word, like the fire behind stained glass. You see it plainly in how he treats the staff. You served tea to him once during a meeting with senior ministers, and he does not look at you. Not once. His words are measured, his posture perfect, but there is no softness, only calculation. You wonder if he sees the king not as a father, but as an obstacle finally being swept aside by illness. The king, meanwhile, is barely present. He has stopped recognizing even the physicians. Some days, he believes he is still a young man, barely crowned. He asks to see his father. He demands his daughter Amelia prepare his writing desk, even though she's been gone for months. When he does come back to himself, it is brief, painfully brief. He'll catch his reflection and frown. Ask whether the lighting has made him look older. You hear him once whisper, "Where did I go?" You bring him his writing implements late one evening, and he grabs your wrist, not forcefully, just enough to still your movement. His eyes lock onto yours. "They think I'm mad," he says. "But it is the world that's wrong. I simply see it for what it is." Then he lets go, closes his eyes, and mutters something you don't catch. The next morning, he doesn't remember the exchange. The bill moves through Parliament with resistance. There are delays, rewrites, public protests. The newspapers are filled with cartoons, mocking both king and prince. You see one tucked under a cushion in the drawing room. His Majesty, surrounded by leeches, chasing stars with a butterfly net. Below him, The prince reclines on a throne made of wigs and wine bottles, but the moment cannot be delayed forever. On February 5th, 1789, the Regency Bill is passed in the House of Commons. It awaits only royal assent. And then, in one of those strange turns history seems to favor, the king begins to recover. Not dramatically, not instantly, but something clears. His speech slows. He begins to respond to names. He remembers that Amelia is gone. He grieves her properly this time, quietly, without confusion. The doctors, astonished and perhaps a little embarrassed, withdraw the most aggressive treatments. The restraints are removed. Curtains are opened. The prince retreats for now, and Parliament sighs in collective confusion. You see the king walking the garden paths again, slowly, with a cane, stopping to smell the frost-bitten hedges. He is thinner, quieter, more careful with his words. But he is George once more. And though the crisis has passed, for now, the scars are visible everywhere. The Regency Bill is shelved, not revoked, not erased, just placed gently into a drawer, waiting. And you return to your quiet post, once again carrying trays and folding napkins. But something inside the palace has shifted permanently. The court now knows what it looks like to plan around a sovereign instead of for him. And George, though seated once more on the throne, can feel the chill that comes with knowing how close the crown came to being worn by someone else. The crisis, technically, has ended, but the strain has not. The cracks have not been filled. And the next time the fog returns, and it will not wait for Parliament's permission to settle over the palace again. They say he never fully returns, not the way he once was. After the 1788 crisis, George walks and talks and signs documents again, but something behind his eyes stays dimmed. The light flickers on from time to time. He gives a speech with perfect diction, plays a familiar hymn on the harpsichord, but it never burns as steadily as before. It's like watching a lantern glow through thick fog, a reminder that the fire still exists, even if you can no longer see the flame clearly. He governs, yes. He presides over meetings, approves appointments, dictates letters to his secretaries with slow, deliberate care. But it's different now. He asks for names more often. He repeats phrases unintentionally. Sometimes he walks into a room and forgets why he's there. And when it happens, he does not laugh or cover it up. He simply sits, folds his hands, and stares at the wall until someone politely reminds him. The court breathes more cautiously around him. Ministers no longer argue in his presence. They present plans already decided, and he nods without resistance. The prince, for his part, behaves himself for a while. He attends dinners, offers compliments, but the look in his eyes tells you he's waiting. Waiting for the next slip, the next silence, the next sleepless week to shift the balance of power once again. The years pass like molasses, slow, sticky, and filled with the weight of unspoken things. The king begins to withdraw further, though his official appearances continue. You hear stories from other servants that he sometimes talks to the paintings now, nodding thoughtfully at portraits of his ancestors as though they're offering him counsel. When he walks in the garden, he speaks out loud, to birds, to trees, to people long gone. He tells stories no one can quite follow, interrupted with hymns, verses from Job, and strange laughter that fades before it finishes. By 1800, his eyesight begins to fail. At first, he squints more, holds books closer to his face, complains about the candlelight. But soon, even sunlight brings him little clarity. You're there when he knocks over a teacup and doesn't flinch, just stares at the empty table where he thinks it still sits. The physicians call it cataracts, but some believe it's another symptom. One more layer of darkness settling over him. He still insists on reading, but someone else must guide his fingers to the pages. He no longer recognizes all his children. Some he calls by their childhood names. Others he mistakes for servants. When the Prince of Wales enters the room, George sometimes greets him as an ambassador from Hanover. Once, he asked the prince to deliver a message to the king, forgetting perhaps that he himself still wears the crown. There are lucid days, of course. Hours where he asks intelligent questions about the Navy or demands to hear the latest dispatches from Vienna. During those moments, you wonder whether he knows, whether deep down, he's aware of the long shadows around him. But if he is, he doesn't say. He plays the role expected of him, even if he can't always recall the lines. Queen Charlotte visits him less frequently. It's not cruelty, it's preservation. Their time together is marked by long silences and soft sobs. When she does visit, she brings flowers and reads to him. His head nods along, but he rarely comments. Once, when she finished a chapter, he smiled and said, "Your voice sounds like Amelia's." The queen said nothing, but she did not return for several weeks. And then, in 1810, Amelia dies. The youngest, the favorite. You're not there when he receives the news. But you hear what happens. They say he screamed. Not in words, not in rage, just sound. A sound so raw and empty, it startled the dogs in the courtyard. After that, he disappears from public life altogether. The physicians move into his apartments permanently. His meals are brought in silence. The windows are kept closed. The king no longer walks the gardens. He no longer hums. He no longer asks after the affairs of state. Instead, he speaks to the air, to the floor, to his own hands. He sings sometimes, cries sometimes, prays out loud in the middle of the night. You hear him through the walls, the same verses repeated again and again. Words smeared together in a slurry of desperation and devotion. By 1811, the Regency Act is passed. Official this time. No debates, no scandal, no last-minute recoveries. The Prince of Wales becomes Prince Regent in name and in law. George III remains king, but only ceremonially. His signature still appears on proclamations, but his pen is guided by others. His portrait still hangs in courtrooms, but no one asks what he thinks. You still call him Your Majesty, still bow when entering his chambers, still serve his tea. But it's ritual now, not recognition. He often doesn't respond. Sometimes he does, usually with a smile and a blessing meant for someone else. In the final years, his blindness is total. The palace prepares his rooms with care, adjusting furniture to prevent falls, laying out garments in the same precise order each day. You learn to speak in a calm, even tone. You announce your name before you approach. When you take his hand, you do so gently, guiding it to the spoon, or the teacup, or the psalms open before him. He thanks you often, always sincerely. Even if he doesn't remember your face, he remembers how to be kind. And though his mind wanders further each day, a strange peace settles over him. He is no longer fighting the world, or the parliament, or even himself. He speaks of heaven more often now, of music, of orchards. He hums melodies no one else knows. He speaks to people no one else sees. And you wonder whether, in the quiet spaces between the confusion, he's finally made peace with the crown he wore for so long. When he dies in 1820, there is no grand final moment. No sudden return to clarity. No whispered words of wisdom. Just a long, slow decline into silence. The nation mourns. The papers print tributes. The court dons black. But for those who saw him in those last years, for those who carried the tray, or changed the linens, or sat quietly while he mistook you for someone else, the mourning feels different, more intimate, more complex. You don't mourn a king of power. You mourn a man who tried to be good, who tried to hold too much together for too long, and who paid for it not with his life, but with his mind. They bury him with full honors. They ring the bells. They read the prayers. And when they lower him into the ground, the crown does not pass instantly, Because, of course, it never truly left his head, not even when he could no longer see it, or feel it, or remember why it was ever placed there. The story of George III ends here, at least in the eyes of the world. But for those who look back, historians, physicians, skeptics, the question lingers. What truly broke within him? What was the nature of that long decline? The root of the visions, the singing, the silence? To answer that, we'll need to dig deeper. Not into the palace, but into the body itself. Into the journals, the letters, the science, and the suspicions that have lingered for more than 2 centuries. And so, with the crown laid to rest and the prince now king, we leave the velvet halls behind and step into the realm of medicine, mystery, and memory. His body had always seemed sturdy, not athletic or towering, not regal in the sculpted marble sense, but dependable. George was thick-wristed, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose boots creaked as he walked, and whose fingers stained with ink from the weight of governance. He walked daily, ate modestly, prayed more than he drank. He rarely fell ill. In fact, for the better part of his youth and early reign, George gave off the impression of someone built to endure. And for years, endure he did. But something inside that solid frame was failing. Not all at once, and not in any way that physicians of his day could measure precisely. No one opened him up. No one took blood under sterile light or scanned his bones. The 18th century had no X-rays, no CAT scans, no neural maps or mental health diagnostics. There were only symptoms, observations, best guesses, a scratch of the quill, and a confident nod. Even now, centuries later, we don't fully know what went wrong, but we've tried to name it. The leading theory? Porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder passed down through families. It can wreak havoc on the nervous system, twist perception, and transform a composed, articulate monarch into a man babbling about angels and refusing to wear socks because they're too loud. The condition affects how the body produces heme, the vital component of hemoglobin. When the system falters, toxins build, nerves fray, pain spreads, and in some types, the mind begins to warp. What makes porphyria so compelling is how well it seems to fit the symptoms. Intermittent madness, periods of lucidity followed by bizarre, cascading behaviors, physical discomfort, especially abdominal pain and sensitivity to light, discoloration of the urine, which royal attendants occasionally mentioned in passing. One of George's physicians, long after the fact, noted that the king's urine turned a deep blue hue during attacks, an odd thing to remark on. But in the strange and often speculative world of retroactive diagnosis, it stands out like a beacon. Decades after George's death, medical historians latched on to these clues and wove them into a compelling case. The condition runs in families, and some suspect other royals may have suffered mild, undiagnosed forms. George's family tree is riddled with tragedies, early deaths, and unexplained behaviors. It all seemed to fit. But that neat narrative raises its own questions. For one, porphyria is rare, very rare, and while the king's symptoms might resemble the illness, there are key inconsistencies. His bouts of madness weren't always accompanied by the expected physical pain or digestive troubles. He rarely complained of the hallmark cramping, and though his behavior was erratic, it didn't always follow the predictable patterns of acute porphyria attacks. Sometimes his worst episodes came after periods of rest and recovery, not stress. Sometimes they came with no clear trigger at all. More importantly, none of the treatments used at the time addressed the supposed cause. He was bled, blistered, and purged with the vigor of 18th century medicine. He was denied light, bound to chairs, fed concoctions laced with mercury and opium. And yet, despite all that, despite the sheer brutality of it, he sometimes improved. Not because of the medicine, but in spite of it. You begin to see how fragile the theory becomes when examined too closely. Porphyria fits, but only when the pieces are shaved, bent, and slotted into place like a puzzle pressed into submission. And even now, long after the candles have gone out in Windsor, researchers still argue. Modern science has tried to weigh in. In the 1990s, a study examined a lock of George's hair preserved in wax. The findings were curious. Levels of arsenic far beyond what would be expected in the average 18th century subject. Arsenic can trigger porphyria symptoms, or mimic them. Or perhaps the exposure came from medication. After all, arsenic was used in everything from stomach tonics to wallpaper. But if the toxin did play a role, it complicates the theory even further. Was it environmental? Accidental? Or was someone deliberately poisoning the king? That last suggestion is rarely made aloud. But in the dark corners of historical speculation, it lurks. After all, a monarch whose power was deeply inconvenient to many, a king who interfered too often, who resisted his ministers, who refused to cede control, could easily become a liability. And what better way to remove such a problem than by encouraging the symptoms that already threaten to surface? There's no evidence of such a plot, nothing concrete, no confession letter buried beneath Windsor stone. But the theory remains, whispered by those who find the politics of his illness too convenient to ignore. It wasn't just his body that failed, they argue. It was his position, his timing, his usefulness. Back in his day, though, no one used the word porphyria. They didn't know what it was. Instead, they spoke of imbalance, of humors gone awry. They treated his mind the way one might treat a clogged drain. Bleed it, shock it, purge it, and wait for clarity to return. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that clarity did return. Again and again, after weeks of suffering, the fog would lift. George would re-emerge from the babble and song, shaken but composed. He would speak softly to the servants, inquire after the affairs of state, apologize even. Imagine waking from a nightmare, only to learn it had been real and witnessed, that your most incoherent, vulnerable moments were studied, documented, passed from physician to politician like a damaged ledger. No diagnosis can fully explain that. No post-mortem theory can account for the shame, the confusion, the relentless cycling of control, lost and regained. It wasn't just a royal body in crisis. It was a soul trapped in a body still expected to rule. And that's where the theories fall short. Porphyria may explain the illness. Arsenic may explain the symptoms. But neither explains the silence, the stillness, the slow walk through Windsor's gardens as courtiers turn away, too afraid to meet your eyes. They cannot explain why a man who once commanded an empire ends his days alone in a darkened room, speaking to the ghosts of his own memory. And that's why, even now, the debate continues. Was it truly disease that broke George? Or was it something deeper, something no diagnosis could capture, no treatment could soothe? The answers, if they exist, aren't tucked in a medical chart. They're buried deeper, in diaries, in notes, in the careful omissions of courtiers who didn't want to be caught choosing sides. To find them, we'll need to read between the lines of what the king left behind. And that means opening his journals. A king wrote endlessly. Letters, speeches, prayers, observations, poured onto parchment in his careful, looping script. His journals, though, are something different, more personal, less curated. They were never meant for the scrutiny of ministers or the press. Just pages of reflection, some orderly, some not. A man trying to make sense of the world from behind a crown that grew heavier with each year. You get the sense, when reading through the fragments that survive, that he truly believed in clarity. That through writing, he could sort the mess of his thoughts into something neat, dignified, useful. That if he recorded enough, each event, each conviction, each daily struggle, he might capture truth like a bird in a cage. And for a time, he almost does. In his early journals, George is meticulous. He writes with precision and formality, chronicling parliamentary events, weather patterns, theological interpretations. There's a steady cadence to his reflections. They reveal a man concerned with virtue, one who measures himself against scripture and duty, like a student afraid to disappoint a stern tutor. He worries over appointments. He questions decisions. He chides himself for irritability and praises his queen with restraint that still feels warm around the edges. But over the years, the tone changes. The sentences get longer, denser. Paragraphs run together without pause. He begins to use phrases like divine light and heaven's arithmetic, sometimes in contexts that make little sense. One entry describes a conversation with a bishop who, records later show, wasn't present that day. Another details a sunrise that echoed in the lungs of angels. At first, these moments feel like poetry, odd but harmless. But then you notice the repetitions. Entire passages copied nearly word for word across multiple entries, as if he forgets what he's already written. Later, the handwriting begins to shift too. Sharp spikes where there used to be curves, lines slanting into the margins. Words written with such pressure, they indent through the next 2 pages. Then, there are the blank pages. Whole stretches of time where nothing is recorded at all, days, even weeks, followed by sudden, erratic bursts of writing, as though the floodgates open after long silence. Those entries are harder to follow. He speaks of voices, not metaphorically, but plainly, mentions instructions given to him by unseen figures, describes visions that seem pulled from dreams or scripture, or someplace in between. What's curious is how little of this was ever acknowledged at the time. The royal archivists, discreet as always, kept the most alarming material tucked away. When excerpts were published, years later, they were carefully edited, polished, sanitized. You wouldn't know from those versions that George once wrote a full sermon he believed had been dictated to him by God through the echo of footsteps in the corridor, or that he claimed to understand birdsong as a divine language of instruction. Those details were smoothed out, lost in the margins. Historians who later sifted through the unabridged copies noted the inconsistencies, the cryptic references, the sudden swings in tone. But even they disagree on how to read them. Some argue the king was simply eccentric, that the pressures of monarchy warped his thinking, but not beyond the bounds of reason. Others believe the entries offer clear evidence of mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or a unique neurological condition, too rare to name with confidence. And then there are the ones who believe the truth lies not in what's written, but what isn't. The missing pages, not torn out, not obviously removed, just gone, spaced evenly across decades of writing. You find entries that end mid-sentence, then resume days later with no explanation. Cross-referencing with official records, you realize those gaps often align with periods of crisis, public outbursts, prolonged silences, rumors of confinement, days when the king disappeared from public view, and the palace whispered more than it spoke aloud. It's possible those pages never existed, that he didn't, or couldn't, write during his worst moments. But some suspect otherwise, that someone removed them. That certain accounts were too troubling, too unflattering, too dangerous for future eyes to read. No official acknowledgement of this exists, of course, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. And even the pages that do survive are frustratingly opaque. The king writes about the veil thinning and the furnace in the brain. He mentions divine geometry and flesh turned to light, but offers no context. One line simply reads, "My blood speaks now. The stars confirm it." That's it. No explanation. No follow-up. The physicians of his time dismissed most of this as religious mania. They believed too much scripture could excite the mind, particularly in one already inclined to melancholy. And there's truth in that. George was intensely devout. His faith formed the lens through which he interpreted nearly everything. But reading the journals, you wonder whether some part of him knew what was happening, whether he sensed the gap widening between who he was and who he used to be. In one of the more coherent entries from the final years, he writes, "I cannot always find myself. There are hours I am missing. I think I live them in other minds." It's a sentence that stays with you, not because it offers clarity, but because it doesn't. It's vulnerable, strange, poetic, and terrifying all at once. And it feels honest. But honesty doesn't mean understanding. Even now, scholars argue over every phrase. Was he suffering from a chronic, untreated illness? Was he experiencing spiritual revelation, distorted by isolation? Was his mind breaking under the sheer weight of responsibility, grief, and hereditary fragility? The truth is likely all of those things, and more. Because what the diaries don't say, the silences, the missing pages, the half-finished thoughts, might be the most revealing parts of all. They point to a man trying to grasp himself as he slips further away. A monarch fighting to document his sanity, even as it unravels beneath his pen. No doctor of his time could decipher that. But even today, we struggle to. And those who tried to help him, those physicians entrusted with royal health, found themselves just as lost. Some were loyal, others opportunistic. But all of them, in one way or another, failed to bring the king back fully. Whether it was because they misunderstood the illness, or because the illness itself defied understanding, no one could say. And so, we turn next to them, to the men who administered the leeches and dictated the rules, who wielded both stethoscopes and political influence, and who may have done more harm than healing. Because if the king's journals can't give us answers, perhaps his doctors will. They came with bags of instruments and scrolls of credentials, powdered wigs tilting like they knew exactly what to expect. Until the king started talking about the Book of Revelation, while removing his stockings because they made his ankles feel too dignified. In theory, they were physicians, learned men, trained, tested, seasoned in the elegant mess of 18th century medicine. But when they stepped into George III's chambers, something always changed. Their hands steadied, but their eyes darted. They weren't just dealing with a body anymore. They were handling a monarch. And every diagnosis was a statement. Every treatment, a political act. The primary figure, at least early on, was Sir George Baker. A solid name. A solid man. President of the Royal College of Physicians. Fluent in Latin and tact. He believed in traditional methods. Balanced the humors, soothed the nerves, and always looked calm while doing it. His verdict? The king's brain was inflamed. Not mad, mind you. That word was too crude, too dangerous. Inflammation sounded reversible. Gentle, like something you could treat with warm baths and a change in diet. Baker prescribed purgatives, bleeding, soft food, limited conversation. No music, no ink, no excitement. Essentially, reduce the king's world to a lukewarm bowl of porridge and hope for the best. The court nodded. The ministers agreed. The treatments began. But when George grew worse, screaming one moment, weeping the next, speaking in Latin and then gibberish, new doctors were brought in. One of the most infamous among them was Dr. Francis Willis, a country physician with a reputation for treating nervous disorders with tough love and moral clarity. He ran an asylum out in Lincolnshire, where his patients plowed fields, rose early, followed strict regimens, and were treated more like farmhands than patients. Willis was summoned to Windsor in 1788 and immediately changed the dynamic. He dressed plainly, carried no title, and when he entered the king's room, he didn't bow. He sat with George, talked to him, and when necessary, restrained him physically. To some, he was a savior. To others, a tyrant. He believed in order, both spiritual and bodily. He kept the king on a tight schedule. Meals at fixed hours. Conversations monitored. Sudden outbursts met with immediate correction, sometimes stern words, sometimes force. George, during one of his more coherent periods, reportedly said he respected Willis, but he also feared him. The line between those feelings blurred more each day. You can't help but notice how political things quickly became. Ministers debated which doctors to consult, not because they wanted the best medical opinion, but because each diagnosis could shift power. If George was judged permanently unfit, the Regency would be enacted. The Prince of Wales, eager and flamboyant, would rule in all but name. And that terrified the current cabinet. The prince leaned toward the opposition. He had debts, friends with ambitions, and far too many opinions. So some doctors were encouraged to delay judgment, to report signs of improvement whenever possible. A few even adjusted their notes after meetings with senior politicians. There was always a new theory, a fresh hope. The king is recovering. The king is resting. The king sang a hymn this morning with appropriate phrasing. Anything to stall the Regency. Others, of course, saw opportunity in the opposite direction. The Prince of Wales and his allies championed a faster diagnosis. They pressed for declarations of insanity. They whispered that George had been unfit for years, long before he began talking to ghosts or repeating the Lord's Prayer 40 times in an afternoon. The poor physicians were caught in the middle, and perhaps poor is the wrong word. Some were wealthy, prestigious, and calculating, but not all. Some genuinely believed they were helping. Others simply tried not to make enemies. But the effect was the same. Medicine became theater. Every leech applied, every tonic offered, every letter sent back to Parliament, none of it escaped political interpretation. When George recovered, however briefly, in early 1789, it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a blow to the Prince of Wales and his faction. The king rode through London in a carriage, surrounded by cheering crowds, his apparent return to health framed as a kind of divine endorsement. Thanksgivings were held in churches. Willis was hailed as a genius. His methods, strict, unorthodox, often harsh, were celebrated as necessary. No one questioned the bruises on the king's wrists. But the recovery didn't last. The episodes returned, sporadically at first, then more frequently. And each time, the same dance began. Doctors summoned, diagnoses debated, Parliament tense, the prince waiting in the wings. In private, the physicians became more cautious. They spoke in guarded tones. They noted symptoms, but avoided conclusions. A few began documenting their own fears, not just about the king, but about being caught on the wrong side of history. One even wrote that the king's condition was made worse by the watching, that every whisper outside his chamber, every anxious servant, every political envoy posing as a well-wisher only deepened the fracture within his mind. And so the treatment never really advanced. No new science emerged, no breakthrough healed him. The care George received was shaped by caution, ceremony, and the endless tug-of-war between stability and ambition. Even now, historians comb through their letters, their prescriptions, their silence, trying to understand who among them truly sought to help, and who merely hoped to be standing close when the crown tipped. You wonder what might have happened if the king had lived in a different age, with psychiatrists, with proper medication, with privacy. But that wasn't his world. His world was one where illness could shift the balance of empires, where every symptom was a secret and every healer a potential agent of change. And for a monarch fading from within, that meant no diagnosis could ever be simple. Not when it came with a crown attached. But perhaps more revealing than the doctors are the places they walked, the corridors, the gardens, the rooms where George wandered during his long decline. If the physicians tell us how he was treated, the palace might tell us how he lived, because buried in Windsor are quiet traces of what he left behind. In the heart of Westminster, beneath the painted ceilings and powdered arguments, George's mind became a chess piece, not a person. Not even a monarch, really. Just a question mark wrapped in royal robes. His illness, so personal, so private, so deeply human, was now public property, whispered across polished benches and scribbled into political pamphlets. It was no longer about what was wrong with the king. It was about what could be done with the fact that something was. Every time the king faltered, Parliament stirred. It started in 1788, when George's first major breakdown sent the court into disarray. He was locked away in Windsor, muttering psalms and weeping into his tea, while in London, the corridors of power buzzed with speculation. The question wasn't whether he was unwell. That much was obvious. The real debate was whether he could, or should, continue to reign. That's where the Prince of Wales comes back in. George's eldest son. Tall, fashionable, draped in debts and silk and a fondness for French wine. He'd always had a tense relationship with his father, trading youthful rebellion for political maneuvering as he grew older. And now, as the king wandered through Windsor quoting Plato and refusing to wear buttons, the prince saw a chance to step forward, not as heir, but as regent. A king in everything but name, but Parliament was split. The Whigs, led by Charles James Fox, supported the prince. They painted the Regency as a necessity, a return to stability. They argued that the king's condition was clearly beyond recovery, and that the government couldn't sit idle while decisions piled up. Privately, they were giddy at the prospect. The prince was one of their own, or at least sympathetic enough to make the idea of power far more pleasant than it had been under George III's cautious hand. The Tories, under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, resisted. Fiercely. Pitt had built his career under the king's favor. He distrusted the prince and viewed Fox as a threat to both policy and tradition. He wasn't about to hand over the kingdom because of a few eccentric ramblings and a penchant for hymn singing. So instead, he stalled. He asked for reports. He requested second opinions. He downplayed the severity of the king's condition. And when that wasn't enough, he rewrote the rules of Regency entirely. That's where the real parliamentary weaponry comes in. Pitt's plan wasn't just to delay the Regency, it was to neuter it. He proposed a bill that would install the prince as regent, yes, but with heavy restrictions. No power to grant peerages. No control over the royal household. No sweeping changes to policy or appointments. Essentially, the prince would be a figurehead, a glorified steward of a kingdom still technically ruled by his father. It was clever, constitutional, and infuriating to the prince. The debate dragged on for months. Meanwhile, George's condition slowly improved. By early 1789, he was lucid enough to write letters again, to meet with advisors, to sit upright without muttering about angels or Beethoven. His recovery, just in time, pulled the rug from under the Regency movement. The bill was dropped. Pitt remained in power, and the prince, flushed with embarrassment, retreated, nursing both political wounds and a growing list of personal grudges. But the precedent had been set. From that point on, every stumble George made, every rumor of relapse, every day spent out of the public eye, triggered speculation. Was the king slipping again? Should the Regency be revisited? Could his madness be used, once more, to shift the balance of government? It didn't help that George's episodes became more frequent. Less explosive, perhaps, but more persistent. He would vanish from view for weeks. He would speak in riddles, refuse counsel. Ministers grew nervous. The prince grew impatient. And behind every formal inquiry into the king's health was a calculation. How could this be turned into leverage? The court, too, became a war zone of subtle sabotage. Some favored the king's continued reign, however symbolic. Others whispered support for the prince, seeing a future where their loyalty might earn rewards. Even the physicians, those chroniclers of mental decline, found themselves drafted into political sides. Their journals dissected not for medical insight, but for ammunition. When George finally descended into near-permanent madness in 1810, it was less a tragedy than a legal inevitability. The Regency Act passed, this time with less drama. The prince became Prince Regent in law. The king, blind and babbling, was quietly removed from the stage. There was no coup, no fanfare, just paperwork. But the damage to the idea of monarchy lingered. For centuries, the crown had been more than a symbol. It had been a person, a figurehead who embodied the state, the nation, the divine right of order. Now, that figurehead had become fragile, vulnerable. His illness wasn't just a private sorrow. It was a constitutional fault line. And those who knew how to exploit it had learned just how easy it could be to blur the line between concern and strategy. Historians still argue over who was most to blame. Did Fox push too hard? Too fast? Did Pitt manipulate the situation for personal gain? Was the prince a grieving son or a power-hungry opportunist? There's no easy answer, because everyone involved believed, on some level, that they were preserving stability or tradition, or the illusion of both. And perhaps most tragically, the only person never allowed to shape that narrative was George himself. His madness became public property, his name stamped on documents he couldn't read, his presence reduced to a legal phrase, his majesty being indisposed, his story rewritten in the language of bills, votes, and parliamentary procedure. And if you look at the official records of those years, those elegant ledgers and printed debates, you won't find much humanity. Just pages and pages of strategy and silence. But the palace itself remembers. The corridors remember. And so do the gardens, the portraits, the quiet spaces where George once walked and tried, against all odds, to remain himself. And deep within those spaces, there are objects, odd remnants of his reign and his illness, that historians still examine today. Fragments of a life that slipped between madness and monarchy. They found the hair in a keepsake box, a neat little curl, preserved under glass with a handwritten label, King George III. It had been tucked away in a collection for years, forgotten behind more glamorous relics, crowns, swords, oil portraits of better-remembered monarchs. But in the 1990s, scientists took a closer look, and suddenly, that lock of royal hair became a doorway into a mystery that had stretched for over 2 centuries. Because if the living couldn't explain what happened to George's mind, maybe the dead could. It started with arsenic, not the murder mystery kind, slipped into tea or baked into cakes, but the slow, seeping exposure common to daily life in the 18th century. When scientists examined George's hair, they discovered unusually high levels of the element, far higher than what would have been expected, even for his era. Arsenic, they explained, can mimic the symptoms of porphyria, or aggravate it, or, in high enough doses, simply break a person's body from the inside out. Theories blossomed. Was George suffering from porphyria all along, and the arsenic made it worse? Or was he poisoned, accidentally, through medications and pigments? Or, as some whispered in darker corners of the academic world, was someone giving him arsenic on purpose? The truth, frustratingly, is that we don't know. Arsenic was everywhere in the 18th century. In dyes, in wallpaper, in some of the very medications George's physicians prescribed. It was used to treat skin conditions, improve complexion, even ward off certain pests. You could absorb it through your skin, inhale it from your drapes, or swallow it in a daily tonic without anyone thinking twice. But high concentrations in the hair point to consistent exposure, not just a fluke or a passing dose, but a steady intake over time. That's where the porphyria theory folds back in. For decades, medical historians pointed to George's strange symptoms, his abdominal pain, his mood swings, his bouts of confusion, as signs of acute porphyria. The illness had a genetic component, and some of George's descendants reportedly showed signs of it too. One physician, reading through letters from George's caretakers, noted that his urine was described as dark and discolored during attacks, a textbook indicator. Others pointed to the king's sensitivity to light, his flushed skin, his headaches. It all lined up, almost too well. And that's the problem. The Porphyria theory, while compelling, isn't perfect. Many of the symptoms it explains could also be attributed to other causes: stress, trauma, or simple overwork. George was under pressure from every direction: losing America, quarreling with Parliament, grieving lost children, fearing the collapse of everything he'd tried to build. His mental collapse might not have needed a chemical trigger. His world was already cracking under the weight of its own expectations. Still, Porphyria remains the frontrunner in the medical community, if only because it offers a name for something that still feels so slippery. But modern geneticists have begun to push back. In recent years, they've analyzed the king's surviving hair using more advanced techniques. And the findings? Mixed. Some samples showed no markers for porphyria. Others did, but so faintly that they fell below diagnostic thresholds. Meanwhile, other theories began to creep in. Could George have suffered from bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, a progressive form of dementia? None of these would have been understood in his time, and all could produce the symptoms described in the journals: racing thoughts, erratic speech, visual hallucinations, emotional spirals. And perhaps most telling of all, periods of full recovery. That last piece remains one of the great puzzles. George didn't simply decline and remain unwell. He came back, repeatedly. His moments of lucidity were not brief flickers. They were full stretches of composure, insight, and functional governance. He held meetings, wrote letters, made decisions. And then, as though a switch had flipped, the confusion returned. That's why historians struggle. The patterns don't match any single illness cleanly. Porphyria offers one set of explanations. Psychiatric disorders offer another. Arsenic lingers in the margins, a chemical wildcard that could tilt everything just slightly off balance. But nothing explains it all. And perhaps most intriguingly, the timeline of George's worst episodes often aligns with moments of personal loss or political strain. The death of a beloved daughter, the humiliation of colonial revolt, the slow erosion of his authority under the Regency. His mind, already fragile, seemed to shatter in response to stress, suggesting that perhaps no diagnosis, no matter how clinical, can truly explain what happened. We want there to be a reason, a name, a Latin word we can circle in a textbook and say, this is what broke him. But sometimes history doesn't offer that neatness. Sometimes it leaves us with clues and contradictions. A lock of hair in a museum drawer, a journal entry about angels, a treatment record listing leeches, and silence. And in the face of all that, we're left with theories. A most human one is that George simply lived too long under too much pressure, with a mind too finely tuned for the weight it was expected to carry. That he broke, not because of porphyria, or poison or madness in his bloodline, but because monarchs are not built to grieve and govern at the same time. Whatever the cause, the outcome remains the same. He spent his final years blind and silent, locked away in Windsor. The physicians had moved on. The politicians had taken over. The empire continued without him. But modern historians still pick at the puzzle. They study his prescriptions. They test his hair. They argue on panels and in papers, trying to decode the life that flickered between illness and duty. And occasionally, they examine what the king left behind, not just in words or relics, but in the institutions he shaped and the family he couldn't quite hold together. Because that family, the heirs, the sons, the squabbling branches of royal descent, would carry his shadow into the next generation. And one in particular, the Prince Regent, would finally get his chance to rule. There's a quiet hum that clings to the royal archives, not the kind that comes from lights or temperature controls, but something older, more deliberate. You feel it when you step inside. It's in the rustle of carefully gloved hands turning a page, in the faint creak of the bindings, in the way archivists speak in lowered tones without needing to be told. These are not just records. They're artifacts of control, stories that have been trimmed, polished, cataloged. And as you begin to walk between the shelves and files, you can't help but notice how much effort has gone into preserving George III, just not necessarily all of him. At first glance, the collection seems comprehensive. There are letters, journals, royal decrees, lists of expenditures for tea and wigs and window glass, reports from ministers, notes from physicians, even receipts for paperweights shaped like Grecian urns. It's impressive, immense, exhausting in the way all bureaucracy is. But then you start to realize what isn't here. Entire swaths of the king's personal writing are missing during key periods of illness. Detailed court logs vanish just as his symptoms worsen. The more you look, the more the silences begin to stack up, thick layers of absence wrapped around crucial years, like someone trying to stitch up a fraying garment. The official version of events is tidy. Too tidy. George's madness has been papered over with euphemisms, wrapped in phrases like delicate nerves, melancholic humors, or episodes of religious intensity. Nothing too jarring, nothing too human. And yet, there are hints. Footnotes that trail off. Dates that don't match. Letters that reference other letters that no longer exist. In one folder marked simply Family Matters, 1811, you find an itemized list of guests who attended a royal dinner. The list ends with a note from the Queen's lady-in-waiting. His Majesty remained, as he was. That's it. No description, no explanation. No hint of whether as he was meant peaceful, absent, shouting, or curled beneath a settee humming nursery rhymes. It's the vagueness that becomes its own kind of horror. Some of the king's surviving correspondence reads strangely clipped, as if his thoughts were being steered by secretaries, perhaps, or by some court functionary trying to keep the tone within acceptable royal bounds. But if you squint past the courtly phrasing, you catch glimpses of the man beneath. One note, addressed to a bishop, reads, "I fear my spirit has been fouled by shadows, and I beg for the rain to clear it." There's no official response. No record that the bishop ever read it. The letter was never sent. Then there's the matter of the redactions. Several journals from palace staff contain entire pages blacked out in thick, smoky ink. These aren't the tidy strike-throughs of clerical corrections. These are broad, heavy obliterations, as if someone was trying not just to hide information, but to erase the emotional weight behind it. You can still make out the occasional word beneath. Groaning, window, restraint. Just enough to unsettle you. Never enough to clarify. And the most mysterious files of all are the ones that supposedly exist, but can't be found. There's mention in a 19th century bibliography of a locked chest labeled Private Papers of His Majesty's Mind. It was described as containing fragments of George's dictated reflections, letters never sent, and observations from his caretakers. But the chest itself is missing. No one can confirm its location. Some archivists believe it was transferred to a private estate. Others say it was quietly destroyed, not by accident, but by design. Because once George III was fully gone, mute, blind, unreachable, his story became vulnerable to interpretation. And what remained had to serve the monarchy, not question it. Even today, the silence shapes what we know. Biographies of the king tend to glide past the most intense periods of his illness. The film and theater versions offer stylized breakdowns, grand monologues, trembling hands, dramatic pauses. But the raw reality is harder to stage, harder to accept, because it's not always theatrical. Sometimes it's just endless repetition. Mutters and whimpers and days where nothing happens, except the slow unraveling of a man whose empire kept going without him. Some historians try to patch together the gaps using secondary sources, letters from courtiers, diary entries from MPs, visitor logs, doctor's bills. But these are only shadows. What's missing isn't just information. It's permission to see George III fully. The real man, the flawed monarch, the frightened husband, the restless father, the human being who, in the face of unimaginable pressure, quietly lost his ability to carry the weight he was born into. And that missing picture becomes especially frustrating when you realize how thoroughly the rest of his life was documented. His youth was cataloged in exquisite detail. His education, his early speeches, the crown placed on his head. His later years, when he had become a passive symbol of monarchy, were documented in ceremonial records and official portraits. But those middle years when he screamed, wept, wandered, whispered to phantoms, those have been polished down to near nothing. The omissions tell a story of their own, not just of royal anxiety, but of a larger fear, the fear that madness could unravel authority, that a broken king might lead to a broken country, that if the people saw too clearly what had happened behind the velvet curtains, they might start questioning the shape of power itself. So silence became policy. Mercy, perhaps, but also strategy. And it worked. George remains a strangely clean figure in public memory. A tragic king? Yes. A stiff, well-meaning man. The one who lost America and wore simple wool coats and refused to be painted with airs. The king who talked to trees but loved his wife. But that image leaves little space for the grim parts. The part where he had to be strapped down, where servants quit out of fear, where his own children avoided his gaze because they weren't sure he recognized them anymore. It's tempting to believe that somewhere, buried in the archives or hidden away in a drawer, the full truth still exists. Maybe it's locked in a box no one's opened in generations. Maybe it's folded between pages of an unsigned letter. Or maybe, as some archivists half joke when the lights flicker, it's hidden in plain sight, inside a volume with the wrong label on the spine. After all, in the royal archives, misdirection is an art form. But even if the missing pieces never resurface, George's presence remains oddly alive. Not through what we know, but through what we suspect. He lingers in the hesitation of scholars, in the half-statements of footnotes, in the nervous humor of biographers who try to explain away a king who defies explanation. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear him between the shelves. Not the king in regalia, not the monarch addressing Parliament, but the man in dressing gowns staring out a frost-covered window at Windsor's gardens, humming a hymn only he remembers. Because while the silence in the archives might obscure the details, it cannot fully erase the imprint he left on the halls of power or on the people who followed him. And among those followers was one figure who loomed larger than most, the Prince of Wales, no longer just an impatient heir, but now the Prince Regent. And what followed, in the shimmering glow of courtly indulgence and powdered opulence, would be the chaotic, dazzling, and often absurd world of the Regency court. It happens without a coronation. No crown lifted, no orb passed from hand to hand, no bells pealing through the capital. Just paperwork. A quiet clause in the Regency Act of 1811, drafted with all the ceremony of a dull financial report. His Majesty King George III, being indisposed, shall henceforth delegate royal authority to the Prince of Wales, who shall now be styled as Prince Regent. And just like that, with the flick of a parliamentary pen, the court belongs to someone else. You wake up one morning in the same royal household, the same velvet curtains, the same white marble floors slick with candle soot, and yet everything feels louder, brighter, perfumed. The silence of George's slow decline is replaced by laughter echoing down the corridors, music leaking from drawing rooms, footsteps that click faster across the parquet floors. The palace is no longer a place of whispers and restraint. It is something altogether different, and the prince, now in charge, wastes no time making his presence felt. To the public, it's framed as continuity, no upheaval, no revolution. The king still reigns technically. His name still graces official documents, still seals proclamations and legal orders. But no one's confused. The Prince Regent is the one pulling the strings now. And unlike his father, who favored simplicity and propriety, the new monarch in everything but name has other plans. He redecorates, first of all, relentlessly. Gone are the sober wood-paneled chambers his father preferred. In their place, towering mirrors, Greco-Roman statues in suggestive poses, furniture gilded within an inch of its life. The Prince Regent doesn't just furnish a palace, he transforms it into a stage and himself into its leading man. Rooms become salons. Gardens are redesigned to mimic ancient temples. Even the tableware is updated. Plates now feature classical motifs and come with price tags most courtiers try not to see. There's a sense among the old staff, those who remember George's gentle fondness for modesty, that the air has thickened. It smells like sandalwood and French powder now. The halls feel swollen with artificial elegance. You keep your head down as you pass rooms full of laughter, wary of the sudden shift in mood. Where once the court had been a place of uneasy quiet, and now roars with appetite, the Prince Regent thrives in this chaos. He throws masquerade balls that stretch till morning, dines on feasts that include a dozen courses and wines from his private collection. His waistline expands along with his expenses, but no one dares point it out. He rides in custom carriages pulled by horses bred specifically to match his coat of arms. He wears velvet suits that take an entire day to press. And always, he is surrounded by people who smile too broadly and bow too low. His father had favored restraint, feared extravagance, and preached the morality of old-fashioned kingship. But the prince? He sees monarchy as theater. If George III was a steward of tradition, his son is the director of spectacle. And yet, beneath the showmanship, the Prince Regent is desperate. Desperate to prove he can rule. Desperate to be taken seriously, even as he surrounds himself with flatterers and piles up debts like dinner plates. He signs legislation with a flourish, but often forgets the details. He nods at military briefings while yawning behind his hand. He meets with ministers between portrait sittings, and more than once, he skips council entirely to attend the opera. But he knows the one thing he cannot afford to appear is weak, so he makes a show of strength in the press. He has portraits commissioned showing him as a Roman general. He invites foreign dignitaries to banquets so ostentatious that they end up in the papers across Europe. He declares that the British monarchy remains resolute and unshaken, even as Parliament mutters behind his back about the costs, the scandals, the groaning national debt he's quietly ballooning. Still, there is no question. He is in charge. The ministers who once circled George III now circle the prince instead, measuring their words more carefully, watching his mercurial moods. Some enjoy the change. Others, especially the older advisors, miss the king's steadiness. But no one can deny that things are different now. The tone, the pace, the focus, and the king? He remains at Windsor, blind, largely silent, cared for by a rotating staff who report dutifully to the household physician. Occasionally, someone suggests he may be improving. A moment of recognition, a whispered phrase. But by this point, such rumors are treated with polite dismissal. The court has moved on. The prince has moved on. And the old monarch is now more symbol than sovereign. Even Queen Charlotte, once so central to George's emotional life, finds herself sidelined. Her health declines. Her presence at court becomes rare. She writes letters filled with worry, but receives few answers. Her sons, caught in the orbit of the regent's court, grow more distant. The family that had once anchored George begins to float away, adrift in the currents of a changing monarchy. The Prince Regent's reign is not official, not crowned, not yet sealed by God or tradition. But make no mistake, it is a reign in all but name, and it sets the tone for the era to come. The Regency, a time of lavish balls and quiet discontent, of brilliance gilded over a crumbling foundation. And within that court, a strange contradiction begins to take shape. The kingdom outwardly thrives, Britain's economy grows, its military flexes abroad, and the empire sprawls across continents. But inside the palaces, inside the families, inside the man now steering it all, there's rot beneath the marble. Because while the Prince Regent may have taken over the court, he cannot quite take over the crown. Not fully. Not while his father still lives. Not while the nation still remembers the man who once walked its gardens, quoting Virgil and mumbling to trees. That memory of a different kind of king continues to echo through the halls, even as the chandeliers are polished and the music plays. And as we follow that music deeper into the heart of the Regency court, we'll see how life under the new ruler unfolded, not from the prince's perspective, but through the people orbiting his shining, indulgent chaos. The courtiers, the stylists, the servants, the sycophants, and the shadows they walked through while trying to keep pace. There's a certain rhythm to court life under the Prince Regent, and it's set not by clocks, but by music. Waltzes, minuets, polkas, whatever happens to be in fashion this month. The palace becomes a kind of glittering carousel, and you're caught somewhere between the gilded moldings and the velvet drapery, trying to keep up with the dizzying pace of an aristocracy, determined to forget that anything serious is happening beyond the ballroom doors. The Prince Regent doesn't just love parties. He needs them. They're his distraction, his performance, his escape. Nearly every evening brings a new event. If not at Carlton House, then at Brighton Pavilion. If not a masked ball, then a musical evening, or an after-supper card game with stakes that would make a banker choke. By the third week of any given month, the musicians are exhausted, the cooks are hoarse from shouting in steam-choked kitchens, and the tailors have taken to sewing by candlelight just to keep up with the mounting demand for silk waistcoats and imported lace. You are reminded constantly of the prince's tastes. Extravagant, theatrical, faintly French. He drapes himself in velvet coats lined with ermine, wears diamond shoe buckles, and speaks with a lilt that seems borrowed from the stage. He flirts in 4 languages and dances with the precision of someone who sees mirrors everywhere. And the courtiers follow suit. It's not enough to be noble. You must be fashionable. Dullness is a sin. Wearing last season's colors is a scandal. Owning fewer than 24 pairs of gloves is a form of social collapse. The balls themselves are breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers catch candlelight like falling stars. Harpsichords hum from tucked-away alcoves. There are endless parades of sparkling champagne, stewed fruits, game pies, so large they require their own footmen to carry. Women sweep by in silks stitched with real silver thread. Men arrive perfumed, powdered, and cinched into tailoring so tight they occasionally pass out mid-dance. But while the court glitters, the finance has grown. By 1813, the Prince Regent's personal debts have soared past £500,000, a staggering figure, especially when measured in the cost of candles and crushed velvet. Parliament, scandalized but wary of public embarrassment, quietly absorbs the debts into the civil list, tucking them behind official line items and bland phrases like household expenditures. But everyone knows, gossip moves faster than carriages. And even in the press, where royal criticism is usually couched in layers of politeness, satirical prints begin to circulate. In one cartoon, the prince is depicted as a bloated Bacchus, swilling wine while dancing on the backs of exhausted taxpayers. In another, he's shown pawning a crown to buy more silk cravats. The prince pretends not to notice, but his ministers do. And so do the international observers. France, still bitter from decades of war, delights in the reports of British excess. Napoleon, no stranger to theatricality himself, is rumored to have called the Regency court a cabaret of pearls and debts. Still, the parties continue, because stopping them would feel like admitting something had cracked. And beneath the surface, there is a kind of desperation creeping in. The prince's laughter grows louder, more forced. His entourage becomes more carefully curated. Invitations to court now hinge not only on nobility, but on usefulness, whether social, financial, or personal. Old friends are quietly dropped. Debtors are shuffled to minor rooms, where they can be tolerated without being seen. Even the architecture begins to feel performative. Rooms are designed not for living, but for being observed in. The Brighton Pavilion is perhaps the most absurd example. Designed in an exotic Indo-Chinese style with onion domes and gilded dragons, it feels like a fever dream made of porcelain and silk. You walk through it and wonder if you've left England entirely. Inside, Chinese wallpaper meets Gothic furniture, and the dining room ceiling is held up by enormous golden palm trees. It's beautiful. It's bizarre. It's everything the prince wants the world to believe about his reign, that it is rich, cultured, unbothered by the grumbling world outside. But for the staff, life is more chaotic than elegant. The sheer volume of linens to be washed, feathers to be cleaned, wine to be uncorked, it's enough to turn even the most enthusiastic footman into a sleep-deprived cynic. Gossip circulates downstairs just as much as upstairs, and is less filtered. Servants laugh about the prince's nightly stomach troubles, the way he sometimes stumbles back to his chambers in his slippers, still humming the final waltz from memory. They whisper about his weight, about his moods, about the late-night arguments with creditors, disguised as visiting gentlemen. There's a growing sense that the entire Regency is a performance waiting for its curtain to drop. Ministers shuffle budget proposals across desks stained with wine. Artists grow rich painting flattering portraits, only to be discarded when the prince finds a new favorite with a lighter touch around the jawline. Even the musicians begin to recycle tunes, too exhausted to write new ones for every masked ball. Still, no one dares stop the music, because the alternative, acknowledging the rot beneath the glamour, is worse. This is a court clinging to distraction, to showmanship, to the illusion that all is well. And as long as the candles keep burning and the velvet keeps arriving by the bolt, the illusion holds. But there are cracks in the marble, cracks that no amount of powdered sugar or imported velvet can conceal. The nobility begins to whisper in private. Ministers count coins twice. And even the prince, once untouchable in his silken confidence, begins to look over his shoulder. Because beneath all the satin and spectacle lies a truth that no one wants to say aloud. The kingdom is dancing in a house with weak foundations. And while the chandeliers sway and the violins play on, the court inches ever closer to a reckoning. And as we slip behind the glitter and follow the quieter corners of the palace, we'll find the people whose job it is to keep this illusion going. The stylists, the tailors, the attendants who smooth the scenes of a monarchy, trying desperately not to fall apart. Serving under the Prince Regent means existing in two worlds at once. One foot in the dazzling theatrical cork he's building by the hour. Lace, laughter, satin shoes polished so bright they reflect ceiling frescoes. And the other in the grayer, sadder realm of a king who still technically lives, tucked away in Windsor's quieter corridors, slipping further into his own vanished logic. As a courtier, your job is to move between these realities with a smile that doesn't twitch and an etiquette manual that rewrites itself daily. In the Prince Regent's world, performance is survival. You learn to praise the architecture you hate, to clap before the overture finishes, to admire the roast peacock you'll never taste. Your clothes must sparkle. Your bow must be deep. And if the prince makes a joke that doesn't quite land, you laugh as though it were the cleverest thing said this century. The key to life here isn't sincerity. It's grace under absurdity. And then, suddenly, you're summoned to Windsor. The tone shifts like a gust of cold air, under a heavy door. Here, everything is quiet, dignified, subdued. You walk slowly. You lower your voice. Even your footsteps are softer, because behind those stately doors, the king is still there, alive, breathing, unreachable. Some days he recognizes his surroundings. Some days he believes he's a farmer again, walking through furrows that no longer exist. Other times he sings hymns to no one in particular, or writes letters to Parliament that will never be delivered. The staff at Windsor operates in a different register, more reverent, more wary. No one gossips here. No one jokes. There's a shared understanding that this is not a place for court games or flattery. It's a mausoleum of protocol, a palace of echoes. And yet, no one dares call it what it is, a waiting room for a king who will never return to his throne. So you go back and forth, from the feasts at Carlton House to the lamplit halls of Windsor, from the scent of French cologne and sugared almonds to the sharp sting of vinegar and medicinal herbs. You learn how to adjust your posture, your vocabulary, your very breathing, depending on which monarch you serve that day. One wears perfume, the other wears silence. One dances with duchesses, the other mutters about angels. It takes a toll. The older courtiers age twice as fast. They've lived through both versions of monarchy, the steady hands of George III in his early reign and the flamboyant gestures of his son in the Regency. They speak in coded language now, unsure who listens behind which door. If someone says, His Majesty is resting, it could mean anything from a nap to a week-long fugue state. If they mention the prince's exquisite judgment, they probably mean the new chandelier weighs too much and might fall. But among the younger courtiers, the ones who came up during the Regency, there's a different energy. They're more ambitious, more polished, more willing to align with the spectacle. They play the prince's games, flatter his whims, learn the shifting tides of court influence like sailors reading the wind. And they know that loyalty to the Prince Regent pays better than loyalty to a fading sovereign who no longer speaks. Still, none of them quite say what everyone senses, that they are living in the twilight of one court and the fever dream of another. And in between, the royal family floats in its own awkward choreography. The king's daughters, aging quietly in their unmarried state, shuttle between visits, rarely seen in public. Queen Charlotte, increasingly frail, spends her time tending to her own ailments. The younger princes, each a character in his own right, dart in and out of favor. Some chase military commissions. Others chase actresses. All of them, in one way or another, orbit the Prince Regent like moons, caught in the gravity of a collapsing star. Even Parliament begins to reflect this dual monarchy. Legislation is signed in the king's name, but debated in the context of the regent's preferences. Ministers hold two versions of every policy briefing, one for the official record, another for the man who actually makes decisions. And foreign ambassadors quickly learn which parties to attend and which invitations to politely decline. It's an age of contradictions, where truth has to wear a powdered wig and bow before it speaks. In the salons and supper clubs of London, this duality becomes fodder for endless discussion. Was the king truly mad, or simply misunderstood? Is the prince a visionary, or a self-indulgent clown? Does Britain rule the waves, or merely waltz around its problems? Cartoonists have a field day. In one print, the regent is shown balancing on a tightrope, dressed as a ballerina, while the king floats behind him in a balloon, labeled Divine Right. In another, courtiers are portrayed as two-faced masks, one side weeping, the other grinning. It's satire, yes, but also recognition. Everyone feels the strain of this double life, this kingdom half in mourning and half in denial. Even the footmen know it. You overhear them talking in the servants' quarters, long after midnight, over bowls of cold stew and stolen sips of port. They talk about the old king's gentleness, the way he used to remember everyone's name, the strange sadness that settled over the palace the first time he forgot his own. They talk about the prince's shoes, how they sparkle even when he's in a foul mood. And they talk about what comes next. Because something always comes next. The nation may pretend this can go on forever, but the truth is beginning to show. The prince is aging. His extravagance no longer charms everyone. His debts can't be hidden forever. And the king, though he remains a shadow, is still technically sovereign. The court, for all its dances and diplomacy, is treading water. And as we drift deeper into the final rooms of the Regency court, we'll step beyond the official chambers and into the world of stylists, staff, and the people who dress the monarchy in its daily disguise, those whose hands quite literally shape the crown's appearance, even as the weight of it begins to buckle from within. By the time the Regency court reaches its gilded peak, Queen Charlotte has vanished almost entirely from public life. Her name is still etched into official correspondence. Her image still adorns portraits in dining halls and galleries. But the woman herself, once the center of George III's domestic universe, is now a quiet echo within the vast chambers of Kew and Windsor, hidden behind heavy doors, lost beneath the shadow of two monarchs, one fading, one pretending not to be waiting. At first, the Queen tries to maintain her duties. Even after George's illness deepens, she attends court events with tight-laced dignity. She writes letters to ministers, offers guidance to her children, tries to present a unified royal image. But there's only so long you can maintain appearances when your husband no longer recognizes you. When he babbles about angels in the garden and asks after children who have long since grown. When the man you once walked with in the royal gardens now shrinks from your touch, mistaking you for a ghost or a nursemaid or someone long dead. So she retreats, slowly, carefully, not in disgrace or collapse, but in resignation. Like a candle extinguished not by wind, but by choice. Her rooms become her kingdom now. At Kew Palace, far from the new glittering world of her son, Charlotte builds a routine of muted order. She rises early, as always. She prays. She reads sermons and court newsletters, even when they make her sigh. Her walks are shorter now, more cautious. Her gowns more modest. The ladies who serve her know to keep their voices low, and their comments kinder than true. She asks after George daily, though by now she rarely visits his chambers. It is unclear if the distance is for his sake or her own. You might pass her in the corridor sometimes. Her steps slow, her eyes scanning portraits she commissioned decades ago. Scenes of family picnics, of the children all in white, of her and George seated side by side in that stiff, awkward pose popular in the mid-century style. She lingers on these images longer now. You'd almost think she was waiting for them to speak. Meanwhile, at court, her absence creates a vacuum. The prince rarely mentions her unless prompted. Courtiers refer to her as Her Majesty in past tense, even while she still draws breath. Invitations to her residence grow less frequent. Ministers send updates out of duty, not expectation. And the Queen, who once mediated between George's sternness and the chaos of their many children, now finds herself alone, figuratively and increasingly literally. Even her daughters, once her constant companions, are dispatched elsewhere. Some remain unmarried well into adulthood, living quietly on the fringes of the royal orbit, seen as too plain or too principled to attract foreign suitors. They write to their mother, but fewer letters come back. Charlotte's replies are slow, increasingly terse. She begins to complain of ailments, swollen feet, faintness, an ache in her chest she calls the tightness. Doctors call it nervous tension. Others whisper that it's just heartbreak in slow motion. In her quieter moments, Charlotte keeps diaries. Not the flowing, confessional kind, but stiff, orderly records of the day's events. What she read, what she ate, whether the weather reminded her of home in Mecklenburg. Scattered among them are odd fragments, lines about George's eyes, or a dream of him walking barefoot on wet grass. Occasionally, she writes down prayers in her native German, as though God might be more inclined to listen in the language of her childhood. The irony is not lost on her. She was once brought to Britain to civilize a king, to offer refinement, stability, a royal womb from which a dynasty might spring. And now, with 12 surviving children and a throne that still stands, she is left with nothing to rule over but her memories. Her influence is withered. Her voice carries less weight than her lace-trimmed handkerchiefs. Even her portrait commissions have slowed. No one wants to paint a queen in half-light. She still receives guests on occasion. Foreign envoys, old friends, bishops who speak to her gently, as if she might shatter if asked to discuss politics. These visits are carefully orchestrated. The rooms are arranged just so. Tea is served in porcelain with blue flowers. Music plays in the background, usually Handel. And then the guests leave, and Charlotte sits a moment longer in her chair, staring out the window as if trying to remember what her gardens looked like when George walked beside her. You hear the staff whisper sometimes about how the queen won't speak of the prince, about how she once wept during a sermon and claimed not to remember doing so, about how she sometimes writes letters and then burns them, about how she insists on being called Queen Consort, even though her husband no longer reigns in any real capacity. There is a quiet tragedy to her days, one that seeps through the tapestries and clings to the air like the scent of drying lavender. And yet, even in her isolation, Charlotte remains a symbol. To the old guard, she is the last pillar of the old monarchy. To some of the younger courtiers, she is a ghost walking the palace in silk slippers. To her family, she is either a duty or a memory. But to you, she is something else entirely. A reminder that beneath the crowns and coronets, the monarchy is made up of people, aging, aching, sometimes forgotten, sometimes preserved in portraits that lie about how happy they were. Her presence hovers over the court, even as her name fades from its conversations. Her silence speaks louder than the prince's proclamations. Her grief for the king, for her vanished influence, for the empire her son is spending away, one masquerade at a time, settles over the palace like a long dusk that refuses to end. And as we step from her faded drawing rooms back into the brighter chambers of the court, we'll meet those whose lives revolve entirely around illusion. The stylists, barbers, and dressers who preserve royal appearances, even when the figures beneath the finery are falling apart. From the outside, everything glimmers. The marble staircases, the velvet upholstery, the polished banisters you could see your face in. All of it creates the illusion of control. A sort of gilded stillness, masking the messy undercurrent of politics during the Regency. But if you stay long enough, if you work in the palace or hover behind the council doors, you begin to sense it. Governance during this era isn't straightforward or solemn. It's theater, plain and elaborate. And like all good theater, it demands precision, applause, and a generous disregard for what happens behind the scenes. The Prince Regent has no taste for dullness. He doesn't want dusty ledgers or lengthy briefings full of cautious footnotes. He wants spectacle. Speeches that sing, legislation wrapped in metaphor, decisions handed to him in bite-sized phrases with flattering footnotes. He prefers statcraft the same way he prefers his suits, tailored, grand, and slightly more decorative than necessary. And yet, for all his extravagance, the machinery of the British state must keep turning. Armies still march. Treaties still need signing. Taxes must be collected. But nothing happens without performance. In his ornate receiving rooms, ministers wait their turn like anxious actors in the wings, scripts rehearsed and posture perfected. They bow low, speak flatteringly, and often find themselves adjusting mid-sentence when the prince waves a distracted hand or reaches for a candied plum. He listens with one ear and watches his reflection with the other. Occasionally, he interrupts with a non sequitur. How does this affect the opera fund? And the ministers nod as though the question makes perfect sense. The point is not discussion, it is deference. But decisions must be made. So much of the real political maneuvering happens after dark, beyond the glowing windows of Carlton House, tucked away in drawing rooms, scented with snuff and cigar smoke. The real conversations happen among confidants, not in the royal presence. Lord Liverpool, Castlereagh, and others operate in a strange rhythm of public formality and private maneuvering. They advise the prince, yes, but also manage him. They know how to redirect his focus when he grows bored, how to present a proposal as his own idea, and when to send a letter instead of a visitor, just in case the conversation might prove too inconvenient. These ministers are not fools. They know the dangers of appearing too competent. It is a peculiar truth of the Regency that political skill must be draped in velvet, softened by politeness, and offered as if it were a favor rather than a plan. To push too hard, to correct the prince outright, to suggest that a policy might need revision, these are risks. And in a court where image trumps insight, risks must be managed carefully. Of course, the theater doesn't stop at Carlton House. It extends across London. Parliament is less a chamber of reasoned debate than a stage for carefully scripted drama. The opposition delivers impassioned critiques with a flair that would do a Shakespearean actor proud. The government responds with equally rehearsed gravity. It is understood by all that this is not merely governance. It is spectacle, with broadsheets and caricaturists standing by to record each misstep and memorable line. The prince knows this and plays his part accordingly. He holds public audiences, gives impromptu remarks laced with flowery language, and commissions artists to depict him in flattering classical poses, as a general, as a philosopher, as a monarch bathed in divine light. The public, in turn, devours the performance, but their patience wears thin. Outside the palace walls, grain prices rise. Veterans return from war to find no work. Riots spark in factories and fields. There are pamphlets handed out in taverns with titles like the Glutton King and the Gilded Burden. Still, nothing changes in the performance. The prince hosts another masquerade. Ministers whisper behind damask curtains. Austerity is preached from within carriages padded in imported silk. Even the prince's charitable acts, donations to hospitals or relief funds, are packaged for display with engraved plaques and carefully chosen beneficiaries. The court seems incapable of reacting in a way that is not at least partially theatrical. It's not that the Prince Regent lacks intelligence. He's well-read, witty, and in private, often charming. But his understanding of power has always been shaped by aesthetics. He believes in the language of appearances, the persuasive power of polish. To him, a beautifully lit drawing room does more to inspire loyalty than any policy paper. And in some strange way, he's not entirely wrong. The Regency survives not on its policies, but on its ability to distract, to dazzle, to blur the line between monarch and myth. But this kind of illusion has its price. Behind closed doors, the prince often grows irritable. He tires quickly of political matters, dismisses ministers with barely disguised contempt, and retreats to his private apartments where only a few trusted servants are permitted. He complains of headaches, of treachery, of ministers who do not understand him. Sometimes he paces well into the night, speaking aloud as if rehearsing speeches that will never be given. In his quieter moments, he wonders aloud if he's more puppet than regent. The staff notice. You notice. The palace grows tenser in those weeks. Orders change quickly. Schedules shift. And all the while, the dressing rooms stay lit, the wigs are powdered, and the performance continues. For now, that performance holds. But you wonder how long it can last. Because what happens when the prince becomes king? What happens when the curtain rises one final time, and the audience sees what lies beneath the stage? The debts, the loneliness, the hollow decisions wrapped in gold leaf? Will the monarchy still command respect? Or will it crumble under the weight of its own illusions? These questions linger, as you make your way down the marble hall. Ahead of you, servants are preparing the prince's costume for his latest portrait. Silk robes, golden braid, a crown that shines but no longer feels like it fits. It is all so carefully maintained. But underneath, something is wearing thin. And in the next room, the stylists are already at work. The hands that smooth the prince's image, adjust his silhouette, and repair the monarchy's next illusion. The formalities remain intact, at least on paper. George III is still referred to as His Majesty. His likeness still rests above fireplaces and court chamber mantels. Documents continue to carry his name in the legal preamble, a hollow signature etched across acts he'll never read. But the truth, long known in whispers and increasingly acknowledged in policy, is that the king no longer reigns. He no longer signs. He no longer sees. And yet, there he sits, alive but absent, a king without a crown, folded into the pages of history while still breathing its air. At Windsor, life around him grows quieter by the year. The royal physicians now speak in hushed tones, not to preserve secrecy, but because the urgency is gone. Their patient is no longer expected to recover. He is stable in the way the dead are stable. He does not scream anymore. He does not lash out. But he also does not rise from bed without assistance or recognize the faces of his own children. On good days, he mutters prayers or hums a hymn. On bad ones, he sleeps for hours, waking only to take a spoonful of broth or glance past the nurse, as if she were part of the wallpaper. Even the corridors reflect the shift. Once bustling with advisors, attendants, and footmen trying to manage the chaos of a sovereign's illness, they now feel more like a forgotten cloister. Paintings hang a little crooked. Dust settles in corners. The hearths are warm, but they are not lively. The palace has become a sort of royal hospice, draped not in mourning, but in polite denial. And yet, he is still the king, technically, which means the fiction must be maintained. Visitors are discouraged, but not forbidden. Ministers send updates he will never read. Family members speak about him in carefully chosen tenses. Father is resting. His Majesty has been informed. The king prefers quiet. And somewhere behind those words is the awareness that the man they once bowed before is no longer fully in the room. Sometimes you wonder what he dreams about. Does he know he's still in Windsor? Does he picture himself at Kew, in a garden he hasn't walked through in years? Or does his mind drift even further back, to the early days of his reign, when the world was bright and full of maps he could still redraw with war or diplomacy? Perhaps in his mind, he's not even a king anymore. Perhaps he's once again the young man obsessed with farming, the one who used to walk the fields in the rain and talk to trees like old friends. He still refers to himself, occasionally, as Farmer George. That nickname, once a term of affectionate ridicule, now feels oddly fitting. His world has grown small, like a patch of earth cultivated with ritual more than reason. His days are rooted in the same soil. Wake, wash, eat, sleep. There are no affairs of state, no debates, no councils. Just the creaking of old floorboards and the rhythm of his breathing. The staff have adapted. They treat him gently, like a porcelain figure that has somehow outlived its shelf. They learn to anticipate his small needs, to interpret his gestures, to speak with a kind of warmth that doesn't expect reply. There is no room for awe anymore, only tenderness. And in that tenderness, a strange kind of loyalty survives, one no longer tied to titles or power, but to memory, to the idea of a man who once was. The royal family does what it can. The daughters visit when possible, though their presence is more ceremonial than emotional now. The Prince Regent rarely comes. When he does, the visits are brief, awkward. He looks uncomfortable in the quiet halls, as if they remind him too much of his future. He brings gifts, embroidered cushions, imported fruit, once even a small harp, but the king no longer responds. He smiles faintly, or doesn't react at all, and the prince leaves again, his perfume lingering long after he's gone. Even among the public, interest in George III begins to fade. Caricaturists move on to newer targets. Pamphlets that once debated his sanity now focus on the prince's spending, the government's inefficiency, the war's toll. The king has become a footnote in his own reign, a quiet shadow behind the louder voices of ministers and regents. And yet, his name still anchors the age. The Georgian era, the legacy of empire, the monarch who lost America, and then himself. In a strange way, his absence becomes a kind of presence. His silence haunts the palace more deeply than any decree ever did. His invisibility has weight. It is in the hesitation of the servants, in the way the court avoids certain rooms, in the way no one ever quite refers to him in the past tense, though it would be easier if they could. He is not gone, but not quite there. A man caught between chapters, held in place by duty and by breath. And as the Prince Regent consolidates his grip on power, reshaping court life in his own reflection, the contrast becomes starker. Where George was disciplined, the prince is indulgent. Where George walked in gardens, the prince builds banquet halls. Where George tried, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes stubbornly, to live within his means, the prince flings gold at his discomfort. The transition is not just political, it is aesthetic, emotional, moral. Still, Windsor remains untouched by this shift. There, the old order lingers, preserved in the quiet shuffling of slippers, the careful folding of bedsheets, the keeping of rituals that no longer serve a purpose. There is dignity in it, however worn. And in that space, George III lives out his final years, not as king, not quite as man, but as something in between. A symbol in slow retreat, moving steadily toward history's margins. You don't speak of it often, even among other staff. There's something sacred about the hush around his name now. But when you light the candles in the hall outside his rooms, when you pause for just a second before stepping inside, you feel it. That this is the end of something. Not a reign, not a government, but a presence. A way of being royal that no longer fits the world it shaped. And as that final presence fades into silence, the story itself begins to settle. The curtain lowers. The palace walls, so long filled with echoes and performance, grow still. And now, as we move to the conclusion of this long, strange royal journey, we'll leave the corridors of Windsor and the stages of Carlton House behind, to take one last slow breath with the man, the myth, and the crown that never quite left his head, even as the world forgot it was still there. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the heavy silence behind Windsor's tapestries to the powdered masks of the Regency ballroom, from a king's trembling hand in a forgotten wing to the son who ruled by spotlight and shadow, it's been a long, slow walk through the flickering corridors of a monarchy, unraveling in silk and ceremony. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the clink of royal teaspoons and the whispered arguments behind closed council doors, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole idea. If you enjoyed this quieter, sleep-friendly walk through royal history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. Drop it in the comments. It's always lovely to see how far these calm little stories can travel. For now, I'll let the candlelight soften, the palace clocks tick gently toward midnight, and the long, silent reign of a forgotten king continue behind drawn curtains. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.